Part 1 of Chapter 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3 Sexual Inversion in Men. When the sexual instinct first appears in early youth, it is much less specialized than normally it becomes later. Not only is it at the outset less definitely directed to a specific sexual end, but even the sex of its object is sometimes uncertain. This has always been so well recognized that those in authority over young men have sometimes forced women upon them to avoid the risk of possible unnatural offenses. The institution which presents these phenomena to us in the most marked and the most important manner is naturally the school, in England especially the public school. In France, where the same phenomena are noted, Tarde called attention to these relationships, most usually platonic in the primitive meaning of the word, which indicate a simple indecision of frontier between friendship and love, still undifferentiated in the dawn of the awakening heart, and he regretted that no one had studied them. In England we are very familiar with vague allusions to the vices of public schools. From time to time we read letters in the newspapers denouncing public schools as hotbeds of vice, and one anonymous writer remarks that some of our public schools almost provoke the punishment of the cities of the plain. But these allegations are rarely or never submitted to accurate investigation. The physicians and masters of public schools who are in a position to study the matter usually possess no psychological training, and appear to view homosexuality with too much disgust to care to pay any careful attention to it. What knowledge they possess they keep to themselves, for it is considered to be in the interests of public schools that these things should be hushed up. When anything very scandalous occurs, one or two lads are expelled, to their own grave and perhaps lifelong injury, and without benefit to those who remain, whose awakening sexual life rarely receives intelligent sympathy. In several of the histories which follow in this chapter, as well as in histories contained in other volumes of these studies, details will be found concerning homosexuality as it occurs in English schools, public or private. See also the study Autoeroticism in Volume 1. The prevalence of homosexual and erotic phenomena in schools varies greatly at different schools and at different times in the same school, while in small private schools such phenomena may be entirely unknown. As an English schoolboy I never myself saw or heard anything of such practices, and in Germany Professor Görlit (Die Neue Generation, January 1909), among others, testifies to similar absence of experience during his whole school life, although there was much talk and joking among the boys over sexual things. I have added some observations by a correspondent whose experiences of English public school life are still recent. In the years I was a member of a public school I saw and heard a good deal of homosexuality, though till my last 2 years I did not understand its meaning. As a prefect I discussed with other prefects the methods of checking it and of punishing it when detected. My own observations, supported by those of others, led me to think that the fault of the usual method of dealing with homosexuality in schools is that it regards all school homosexualists as being in one class together, and has only one way of dealing with them: the birch for a first offense, expulsion for a second. Now I think we may distinguish 3 classes of homosexualists: a very small number who are probably radically inverted, and who do not scruple to sacrifice young and innocent boys to their passions. These, and these only, are a real moral danger to others, and I believe them to be rare. B, boys of various ages who, having been initiated into the passive part in their young days, continue practices of an active or passive kind, but only with boys already known to be homosexualists. They draw the line at corrupting fresh victims. This class realize more or less what they are about, but cannot be called a danger to the morals of pure boys. C, young boys who, whether in the development of their own physical nature or by the instruction of older boys of the class A, find out the pleasures of masturbation or intercrural connection. I never heard of a case of pedicatio at my school, and only once of fellatio, which was attempted on a quite young boy who complained to his housemaster, and the offender was expelled. Boys in this class have probably little or no idea of what sexual morality means, and can hardly be accused of a moral offense at all. I submit that these 3 classes should receive quite different treatment. Expulsion may occasionally be necessary for Class A, but the few who belong to this class are usually too cunning to get caught. It used to be notorious at school that it was almost always the wrong people who got dropped on. I do not think a boy in the other two classes should ever be expelled, and even when expulsion is unavoidable, it should, if possible, be deferred till the end of the term, so as to make it indistinguishable from an ordinary departure. After all, there is no reason to ruin a boy's prospects because he is a little beast at 16. There are very few hopeless incorrigibles at that age. As regards the other two classes, I should begin by giving boys very much fuller enlightenment on sexual subjects than is usually done before they go to a public school at all. Either a boy is pitchforked into the place in utter innocence and ignorance, and yields to temptations to do things which he vaguely, if at all, realizes are wrong, and that only because a puzzling sort of instinct tells him so, or else he is given just enough information to whet his curiosity, usually in the shape of warnings against certain apparently harmless bodily acts, which he not unnaturally tries out of curiosity, and finds them very pleasant. It may be undesirable that a boy should have full knowledge at the time he goes to school, but it is more undesirable that he should go with a burning curiosity or a total ignorance on the subject. I am convinced that much might be done in the way of prevention if boys were told more and allowed to be open. Much of the pleasure of sexual talk among boys I believe to be due to the spurious interest aroused by the fact that it is forbidden fruit and involves risk if caught. It seems to me that frankness is far more moral than suggestion. I would not expurgate school editions of great authors. The frank obscenity of parts of Shakespeare is far less immoral than the prurient prudishness which declines to print it, but numbers the lines in such a way that the boy can go home and look up the omitted passage in a complete edition with a distinct sense of guilt, which is where the harm comes in. It is probable that only a small proportion of homosexual boys in schools can properly be described as vicious. A. Hoch, describing homosexuality in German schools, and putting together communications received from various medical men regarding their own youthful experiences at school, finds relationships of the kind very common, usually between boys of different ages and school classes. According to one observer, the feminine or passive part was always played by a boy of girlish form and complexion, and the relationships were somewhat like those of normal lovers, with kissing, poems, love letters, scenes of jealousy, sometimes visits to each other in bed, but without masturbation, pederasty, or other grossly physical manifestations. From his own youthful experience, Hoche records precisely similar observations, and remarks that the lovers were by no means recruited from the vicious elements in the school. The elder scholars, of 21 or 22 years of age, formed regular sexual relationships with the servant girls in the house. It is probable that the homosexual relationships in English schools are, as a rule, not more vicious than those described by Hoche, but that the concealment in which they are wrapped leads to exaggeration. In the course of a discussion on this matter over 30 years ago, Olim Etoniensis wrote (Journal of Education, 1882) that on making a list of the vicious boys he had known at Eton, he found that these very boys had become cabinet ministers, statesmen, officers, clergymen, country gentlemen, etc., and that they are nearly all of them fathers of thriving families, respected and prosperous. But, as Marrow has remarked, the question is not thus settled. Public distinction by no means necessarily implies any fine degree of private morality. Sometimes the manifestations thus appearing in schools, or wherever youths are congregated together, are not truly homosexual, but exhibit a more or less brutal or even sadistic perversion of the immature sexual instinct. This may be illustrated by the following narrative concerning a large London city warehouse. "A youth left my class at the age of 16 and a half," writes a correspondent, "to take up an apprenticeship in a large wholesale firm in G. Street. Fortunately, he went on probation of 3 weeks before articling. He came to me at the end of the first week, asking me to intercede with his mother (he had no father) not to let him return. He told me that almost nightly, and especially when new fellows came, the youths in his dormitory, 11 in number, would waylay him, hold him down, and rub his parts to the tune of some comic song or dance music. The boy who could choose the fastest time had the privilege of performing the operation, and most had to be the victim in turn unless new boys entered, when they would sometimes be subjected to this for a week. This boy, having been brought up strictly, was shocked, dazed, and alarmed, but they stopped him from calling out, and he dared not report it. Most boys entered direct on their apprenticeship without probation, and had no chance to get out. I procured the boy's release from the place, and gave the manager to understand what went on. In such a case as this, it has usually happened that a strong boy of brutal and perverse instincts and some force of character initiates proceedings which the others either fall into with complacency or are too weak to resist. Max Dessoir came to the conclusion that an undifferentiated sexual feeling is normal on the average during the first years of puberty, i.e., from 13 to 15 in boys and from 12 to 14 in girls, while in later years it must be regarded as pathological. He added very truly that in this early period the sexual emotion has not become centered in the sexual organs. This fact is certainly far too often forgotten by grown-up persons who suspect the idealized passion of boys and girls of a physical side which children have often no suspicion of, and would view with repulsion and horror. How far the sexual instinct may be said to be undifferentiated in early puberty as regards sex is a little doubtful. It is comparatively undifferentiated, but, except in rare cases, it is not absolutely undifferentiated. We have to admit, however, that in the opinion of the latest physiologists of sex, such as Castle, Heap, and Marshall, each sex contains the latent characteristics of the other or recessive sex. Each sex is latent in the other, and each, as it contains the characters of both sexes and can transmit those of the recessive sex, is latently hermaphrodite. A homosexual tendency may thus be regarded as simply the physical manifestation of special characters of the recessive sex, susceptible of being evolved under changed circumstances such as may occur near puberty and associated with changed metabolism. William James, Principles of Psychology, considered inversion a kind of sexual appetite of which very likely most men possess the germinal possibility. Connolly Norman, article Sexual Perversions, Tuke's Dictionary of Psychological Medicine, also stated that the sexual passion at its first appearance is always indefinite and is very easily turned in a wrong direction, and he apparently accounted for inversion by this fact and by the precocity of neurotics. Orbici and Marchesini refer to the indeterminate character of the sexual feelings when they first begin to develop. A correspondent believes that sexual feelings are undifferentiated in the early years about puberty, but at the same time considers that school life is to some extent responsible. The holidays, he adds, are sufficiently long to counteract it. However, provided the boy has sisters and they have friends, the change from school fare and work to home naturally results in a greater surplus of nerve force, and I think most boys fool about with servants or their sisters' friends. Moll, Konträre Sexualempfindung, 1889, does not think it proved that a stage of undifferentiated sexual feeling always occurs, although we have to recognize that it is of frequent occurrence. In his later work, Moll remains of the same opinion that a homosexual tendency is very frequent in normal children, whose later development is quite normal. It begins between the ages of 7 and 10, or even at 5, and may last to 20. In recent years, Freud has accepted and developed the conception of the homosexual strain as normal in early life. Thus, in 1905, in his Bruchstück einer Hysterieanalyse, Freud regards it as a well-known fact that boys and girls at puberty normally show plain signs of the existence of a homosexual tendency. Under favorable circumstances, this tendency is overcome, but when a happy heterosexual love is not established, it remains liable to reappear under the influence of an appropriate stimulus. In the neurotic, these homosexual germs are more highly developed. I have never carried through any psychoanalysis of a man or a woman, Freud states, without discovering a very significant homosexual tendency. Ferenczi, again, without reference to any physical basis of the impulse, accepts the psychic capacity of the child to direct his originally objectless eroticism to one or both sexes, and terms this disposition ambisexuality. The normality of a homosexual element in early life may be said to be accepted by most psychoanalysts, even of the schools that are separated from Freud. Sterkel would go farther, and regards various psychic sexual anomalies as signs of a concealed bisexual tendency. Psychic impotence, the admiration of men for masculine women and of women for feminine men, various forms of fetishism. They are all masks of homosexuality. These schoolboy affections and passions arise to a large extent spontaneously with the evolution of the sexual emotions, though the method of manifestation may be a matter of example or suggestion. As the sexual emotions become stronger and as the lad leaves school or college to mix with men and women in the world, the instinct usually turns into the normal channel, in which channel the instincts of the majority of boys have been directed from the earliest appearance of puberty, if not earlier. But a certain proportion remain insensitive to the influence of women, and these may be regarded as true sexual inverts. Some of them are probably individuals of somewhat undeveloped sexual instincts. The members of this group are of some interest psychologically, although from the comparative quiescence of their sexual emotions they have received little attention. The following communication, which I have received from a well-accredited source, is noteworthy from this point of view. The following facts may possibly be of interest to you, though my statement of them is necessarily general and vague. I happen to know intimately 3 cases of men whose affections have chiefly been directed exclusively to persons of their own sex. The first, having practiced masturbation as a boy, and then for some 10 years ceased to practice it, to such an extent that he even inhibited his erotic dreams, has since recurred to it deliberately at about fortnightly intervals, as a substitute for copulation, for which he has never felt the least desire. But occasionally, when sleeping with a male friend, he has emissions in the act of embracing. The second is constantly, and to an abnormal extent, I should say, troubled with erotic dreams and emissions, and takes drugs by doctor's advice to reduce this activity. He has recently developed a sexual interest in women, but for ethical and other reasons does not copulate with them. Of the third I can say little, as he has not talked to me on the subject, but I know that he has never had intercourse with women, and has always had a natural and instinctive repulsion to the idea. In all these I imagine the physical impulse of sex is less imperative than in the average man. The emotional impulse, on the other hand, is very strong. It has given birth to friendships of which I find no adequate description anywhere but in the dialogues of Plato, and beyond a certain feeling of strangeness at the gradual discovery of a temperament apparently different to that of most men, it has provoked no kind of self-reproach or shame. On the contrary, the feeling has been rather one of elation in the consciousness of a capacity of affection which appears to be a finer and more spiritual than that which commonly subsists between persons of different sexes. These men are all of intellectual capacity above the average, and one is actively engaged in the world, where he is both respected for his capacity and admired for his character. I mention this particularly because it appears to be the habit in books upon this subject to regard the relation in question as pathological, and to set cases where those who are concerned in it are tormented with shame and remorse. In the cases to which I am referring, nothing of the kind subsists. In all these cases, a physical sexual attraction is recognized as the basis of the relation, but as a matter of feeling and partly also of theory, the ascetic ideal is adopted. These are the only cases with which I am personally and intimately acquainted, but no one can have passed through a public school and college life without constantly observing indications of the phenomenon in question. It is clear to me that in a large number of instances there is no fixed line between what is called distinctively friendship and love, and it is probably the influence of custom and public opinion that in most cases finally specializes the physical passion in the direction of the opposite sex. The classification of the varieties of homosexuality is a matter of difficulty, and no classification is very fundamental. The early attempts of Krafft-Ebing and others at elaborate classification are no longer acceptable. Even the most elementary groupings become doubtful when we have definitely to fit our cases into them. The old distinction between congenital and acquired homosexuality has ceased to possess significance. When we have recognized that there is a tendency for homosexuality to arise in persons of usually normal tendency who are placed under conditions, as on board ship or in prison, where the exercise of normal sexuality is impossible, there is little further classification to be achieved along this line. We have gone as far as is necessary by admitting a general undefined homosexuality, a relationship of unspecified nature to persons of the same sex, in addition to the more specific sexual inversion. It may now be said to be recognized by all authorities, even by Freud, who emphasizes a special psychological mechanism by which homosexuality may become established, that a congenital predisposition, as well as an acquired tendency, is necessary to constitute true inversion, apparent exceptions being too few to carry much weight. Krafft-Ebing, Näcke, Ivan Bloch, who at one time believed in the possibility of acquired inversion, all finally abandoned that view, and even Schrenck-Notzing, a vigorous champion of the doctrine of acquired inversion 20 years ago, admits the necessity of a favoring predisposition, an admission which renders the distinction between innate and acquired an unimportant, if not merely verbal, distinction. Supposing, indeed, that we are prepared to admit that true inversion may be purely acquired, the decision in any particular case must be extremely difficult, and I have found very few cases which, even with imperfect knowledge, could fairly be so termed. Even the cases, to which Schopenhauer long since referred, in which inversion is only established late in life, are no longer regarded as constituting a difficulty in accepting the doctrine of the congenital nature of inversion. In such cases the inversion is merely retarded. The conception of retarded inversion, that is to say, a latent congenital inversion becoming manifest at a late period in life, was first brought forward by Thoinot in 1898 in his Attentat aux Moeurs, in order to supersede the unsatisfactory conception, as he considered it to be, of acquired inversion. Thoinot regarded retarded inversion as relatively rare and of no great importance, but more accessible to therapeutic measures. 3 years later, Krafft-Ebing, towards the close of his life, adopted the same conception. The cases to which he applied it were all, he considered, of bisexual disposition, and usually also marked by sexual hyperesthesia. This way of looking at the matter was speedily championed by Näcke, and may now said to be widely accepted. Moll, earlier than Thoinot, had pointed out that it is difficult to believe that homosexuality in late life can ever be produced without at least some inborn weakness of the heterosexual impulse, and that we must not deny the possibility of heredity even when homosexuality appears at the age of 50 or 60. Moll believes it is very doubtful whether heterosexual satiety alone can ever suffice to produce homosexuality. Näcke was careful to set aside the cases to which much significance was once attached, in which old men with failing sexual powers, or younger men exhausted by heterosexual debauchery, are attracted to boys. In such cases, which include the majority of those appearing late, Näcke regarded the inversion as merely spurious, the faute de mieux of persons no longer apt for normal sexual activity. Such cases, no doubt, need more careful psychological study than they usually receive. Féré once investigated a case of this kind in which a healthy young man, though with slightly neurotic heredity on one side, practiced sexual intercourse excessively between the ages of 20 and 23. Often impelled by more amour propre, or what Adler would term the masculine protest of the organically inferior, than sexual desire, and then suddenly became impotent, at the same time losing all desire, but without any other loss of health. 6 months later potency slowly returned, though never to the same extent, and he married. At the age of 35, symptoms of locomotor ataxia began to appear, and some years later he again became impotent, but without losing sexual desire. Suddenly, one day, on sitting in close contact with a young man at a table d'hôte, he experienced a violent erection. He afterward found that the same thing occurred with other young men, and, though he had no psychic desire for men, he was constrained to seek such contact, and a repugnance for women and their sexuality arose. 5 months later a complete paraplegic impotence set in, and then both the homosexual tendency and the aversion to women disappeared. In such a case, under the influence of disease, excessive stimulation seems to result in more or less complete sexual anesthesia, just as temporarily we may be more or less blinded by excessive light, and functional power reasserts itself under the influence of a different and normally much weaker stimulus. Lepman, who has studied the homosexual manifestations of previously normal old men towards boys, considers the chief factor to be a flaring up of the sexual impulse in a perverted direction in an early stage of morbid cerebral disturbance, not amounting to insanity and not involving complete irresponsibility. In such cases, Lepman believes the subject may, through his lack of power, be brought back to the beginning of his sexual life and to the perhaps unconsciously homosexual attractions of that age. End of Part 1 of Chapter 3. Recording by John Fricker. Part 2 of Chapter 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2 by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. With the recognition that homosexuality in youth may be due to an as yet undifferentiated sexual impulse, homosexuality in mature age to a retarded development on a congenital basis, and homosexuality in old age to a return to the attitude of youth, the area of spurious or pseudo-homosexuality seems to me to be very much restricted. Most, perhaps all, authorities still accept the reality of this spurious homosexuality in heterosexual persons, but they enter into no details concerning it, and they bring forward no minutely observed cases in which it occurred. Hirschfeld, in discussing the diagnosis of homosexuality and seeking to distinguish genuine from spurious inverts, enumerates three classes of the latter. 1. Those who practice homosexuality for purposes of gain, more especially male prostitutes and blackmailers. 2. Persons who, from motives of pity, good nature, friendship, etc., allow themselves to be the objects of homosexual desire. 3. Normal persons who, when excluded from the society of the opposite sex, as in schools, barracks, on board ship, or in prison, have sexual relations with persons of their own sex. Now Hirschfeld clearly realizes that the mere sexual act is no proof of the direction of the sexual impulse. It may be rendered possible by mechanical irritation, as by the stimulation of a full bladder, and in women without any stimulation at all. Such cases can have little psychological significance. Moreover, he seems to admit that some subdivisions of his first class are true inverts. He further mentions that some 75% of the individuals included in these classes are between 15 and 25 years of age, that is to say, that they have scarcely emerged from the period when we have reason to believe that, in a large number of individuals at all events, the sexual impulse is not yet definitely differentiated, so that neither its homosexual nor its heterosexual tendencies can properly be regarded as spurious. If indeed we really accept the very reasonable view that the basis of the sexual life is bisexual, although its direction may be definitely fixed in a heterosexual or homosexual direction at a very early period in life, it becomes difficult to see how we can any longer speak with certainty of a definitely spurious class of homosexual persons. Every one of Hirschfeld's three classes may well contain a majority of genuinely homosexual or bisexual persons. The prostitutes and even the blackmailers are certainly genuine inverts in very many cases. Those persons, again, who allow themselves to be the recipients of homosexual attentions may well possess traces of homosexual feeling, and are undoubtedly, in very many cases, lacking in vigorous heterosexual impulse. Finally, the persons who turn to their own sex when forcibly excluded from the society of the opposite sex can by no means be assumed, without question, to be normal heterosexual persons. It is only a small proportion of heterosexual persons who experience these impulses under such conditions. There are always others who, under the same conditions, remain emotionally attracted to the opposite sex and sexually indifferent to their own sex. There is evidently a difference, and that difference may most reasonably be supposed to be in the existence of a trace of homosexual feeling which is called into activity under the abnormal conditions and subsides when the stronger heterosexual impulse can again be gratified. The real distinction would seem, therefore, to be between a homosexual impulse so strong that it subsists even in the presence of the heterosexual object, and a homosexual impulse so weak that it is eclipsed by the presence of the heterosexual object. We could not, however, properly speak of the latter as any more spurious or pseudo than the former. A heterosexual person who experiences a homosexual impulse in the absence of any homosexual disposition is not today easy to accept. We can certainly accept the possibility of a mechanical or other non-sexual stimulus leading to a sexual act contrary to the individual's disposition. But usually it is somewhat difficult to prove, and when proved it has little psychological significance or importance. We may expect, therefore, to find pseudo-homosexuality or spurious homosexuality playing a dwindling part in classification. The simplest of all possible classifications, and that which I adopted in the earlier editions of the present study, merely seeks to distinguish between those who, not being exclusively attracted to the opposite sex, are exclusively attracted to the same sex, and those who are attracted to both sexes. The first are the homosexual, whether or not the attraction springs from genuine inversion. The second are the bisexual, or, as they were formerly more often termed following Crawdads, psychosexual hermaphrodites. There would thus seem to be a broad and simple grouping of all sexually functioning persons into three comprehensive divisions: the heterosexual, the bisexual, and the homosexual. Even this elementary classification seems, however, of no great practical use. The bisexual group is found to introduce uncertainty and doubt. Not only a large proportion of persons who may fairly be considered normally heterosexual have at some time in their lives experienced a feeling which may be termed sexual towards individuals of their own sex, but a very large proportion of persons who are definitely and markedly homosexual are found to have experienced sexual attraction toward, and have had relationships with, persons of the opposite sex. The social pressure urging all persons into the normal sexual channel suffices to develop such slight germs of heterosexuality as homosexual persons may possess, and so to render them bisexual. In the majority of adult bisexual persons it would seem that the homosexual tendency is stronger and more organic than the heterosexual tendency. Bisexuality would thus in a large number of cases be comparable to ambidexterity, which Beervliet has found to occur most usually in people who are organically left-handed. While therefore the division into heterosexual, bisexual, and homosexual is a useful superficial division, it is scarcely a scientific classification. In the face of these various considerations, and in view of the fact that, while I feel justified in regarding the histories of my case as reliable so far as they go, I have not been always able to explore them extensively, it has seemed best to me to attempt no classification at all. The order in which the following histories appear is not, therefore, to be regarded as possessing any significance. It may be proper at this point to say a few words as to the reliability of the statements furnished by homosexual persons. This has sometimes been called in question. Many years ago we used to be told that inverts are such lying and deceitful degenerates that it was impossible to place reliance on anything they said. It was also usual to say that when they wrote autobiographical accounts of themselves they merely sought to mould them in the fashion of those published by Krafft-Ebing. More recently, the psychoanalysts have made a more radical attack on all histories not obtained by their own methods as being quite unreliable, even when put forth in good faith, in part because the subject withholds much that he either regards as too trivial or too unpleasant to bring forward, and in part because he cannot draw on that unconscious field within himself wherein, it is held, the most significant facts of his own sexual history are concealed. Thus Sadger vigorously puts forward this view and asserts that the autobiographies of inverts are worthless, although his assertions are somewhat discounted by the fact that they accompany an autobiography written in the usual manner to which he attributes much value. The objection to homosexual autobiographic statements dates from a period when the homosexual were very little known, and it was supposed that their moral character generally was fairly represented by a small section among them which attracted more attention than the rest by reason of discreditable conduct. But in reality, as we now know, there are all sorts of people, with all varieties of moral character, to be found among inverts, just as among normal people. Sadger complains of the great insincerity of inverts in not acknowledging their inversion. But, as Sadger himself admits, we cannot be surprised at this so long as inversion is counted as a crime. The most normal persons under similar conditions would be similarly insincere. If the homosexual differ in any respect under this aspect from the heterosexual, it is by exhibiting a more frequent tendency to be slightly neuropathic, nervously sensitive, and femininely emotional. These tendencies, while on the one hand are liable to induce a very easily detectable vanity, may also lead to an unusual self-subordination to veracity. On the whole, it may be said, in my own experience, that the best histories written by the homosexual compare favorably for frankness, intelligence, and power of self-analysis with those written by the heterosexual. The ancient allegation that inverts have written their own histories on the model or under the suggestion of those publishing Krafft Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis can scarcely have much force now that the published histories are so extremely varied and numerous that they cannot possibly produce any uniform impression on the most sensitively receptive mind. As a matter of fact, there is no doubt that inverts have frequently been stimulated to set down the narrative of their own experiences through reading those written by others, but the stimulation has, as often as not, lain in the fact that their own experiences have seemed different, not that they have seemed identical. The histories that they read only serve as models in the sense that they indicate the points on which information is desired. I have often been able to verify this influence, which would in any case seem to be fairly obvious. Psychoanalysis is, in theory, an ideal method of exploring many psychic conditions, such as hysteria and obsessions, which are obscure and largely concealed beneath the psychic surface. In most homosexual cases, the main facts are, with the patient's goodwill and the investigator's tact, not difficult to ascertain. Any difficulties which psychoanalysis may help to elucidate mainly concern the early history of the case in childhood, and regarding these, psychoanalysis may sometimes raise questions which it cannot definitely settle. Psychoanalysis reveals an immense mass of small details, any of which may or may not possess significance, and in determining which are significant the individuality of the psychoanalyst cannot fail to come into play. He will necessarily tend to arrange them according to a system. If, for instance, he regards infantile incestuous emotions or early narcissism as an essential feature of the mechanism of homosexuality, a conscientious investigator will not rest until he has discovered traces of them, as he very probably will. But the exact weight and significance of these traces may still be doubtful, and even if considerable in one case may be inconsiderable in another. Freud, who sets forth one type of homosexual mechanism, admits that there may be others. Moreover, it must be added that the psychoanalytic method by no means excludes unconscious deception by the subject, as Freud found, and so was compelled to admit the patient's tendency to fantasy, as Adler has to fictions, as a fundamental psychic tendency of the unconscious. The force of these considerations is now beginning to be generally recognized. Thus Moll rightly says that while the invert may occasionally embroider his story, the expert can usually distinguish between the truth and the poetry, though it is unnecessary to add that complete confidence on the patient's part is necessary. Näcke, again, after quoting with approval the remark of one of the chief German authorities, Dr. Numa Praetorius, that a great number of inverts' histories are at least as trustworthy as the attempts of psychoanalysts, especially when they come from persons skillful in self-analysis, adds that even Freudian analysis gives no absolute guarantee for truth. A healthy skepticism is justifiable, but not an unhealthy skepticism. Hirschfeld, also, whose knowledge of such histories is unrivaled, remarks that while we may now and then meet with a case of pseudologica fantastica in connection with psychic debility on the basis of a psychopathic constitution, taken all in all, any generalized assertion of the falsehood of inverts is an empty fiction, and is merely a sign that the physicians who make it have not been able to win the trust of the men and women who consult them. My own experience has fully convinced me of the truth of this statement. I am assured that many of the inverts I have met not only possess a rare power of intellectual self-analysis, stimulated by the constant and inevitable contrast between their own feelings and those of the world around them, but an unsparing sincerity in that self-analysis not so very often attained by normal people. The histories which follow have been obtained in various ways, and are of varying degrees of value. Some are of persons whom I have known very well for very long periods, and concerning whom I can speak very positively. A few are from complete strangers, whose good faith, however, I judge from internal evidence that I am able to accept. 2 or 3 were written by persons who, though educated, in one case a journalist, had never heard of inversion, and imagined that their own homosexual feelings were absolutely unique in the world. A fair number were written by persons whom I do not know myself, but who are well known to others, in whose judgment I feel confidence. Perhaps the largest number are concerned with individuals who wrote to me spontaneously in the first place, and whom I have at intervals seen or heard from since, in some cases during a very long period, so that I have slowly been able to fill in their histories, although the narratives, as finally completed, may have the air of being written down at a single sitting. I have not admitted any narrative which I do not feel that I am entitled to regard as a substantially accurate statement of the facts, although allowance must occasionally be made for the emotional colouring of these facts, the invert sometimes cherishing too high an opinion and sometimes too low an opinion of his own personality. History 1. Both parents healthy. Father of unusually fine physique. He is himself a manual worker and also of exceptionally fine physique. He is, however, of nervous temperament. He is mentally bright, though not highly educated, a keen sportsman, and in general a good example of an all-round healthy Englishman. While very affectionate, his sexual desires are not strongly developed on the physical side, and seem never to have been so. He sometimes masturbated about the age of puberty, but never afterward. He does not appear to have well-marked erotic dreams. There used to be some attraction toward women, though it was never strong. At the age of 26 he was seduced by a woman, and had connection with her once. Afterward he had reason to think she had played him false in various ways. This induced the strongest antipathy not only to this woman, but to all marriageable women. A year after this episode homosexual feeling first became clear and defined. He is now 33 and feels the same antipathy to women. He hates even to speak of marriage. There has only been one really strong attraction toward a man of about the same age, but of different social class, and somewhat a contrast to him, both physically and mentally. So far as the physical act is concerned, this relationship is not definitely sexual, but it is of the most intimate possible kind, and the absence of the physical act is probably largely due to circumstances. At the same time, there is no conscious desire for the act for its own sake, and the existing harmony and satisfaction are described as very complete. There is no repulsion to the physical side, and he regards the whole relationship as quite natural. History 2. B.O. English, aged 35, missionary abroad. A brother is more definitely inverted. B.O. has never had any definitely homosexual relationships, although he has always been devoted to boys, nor has he had any relationships with women. As regards women, he says, I feel I have not the patience to try and understand them. They are petulant and changeable, etc. He objects to being called abnormal, and thinks that people like himself are extremely common. I have never wanted to kiss boys, he writes, nor to handle them in any way except to put my arm around them at their studies and at other similar times. Of course, with really little boys it is different, but boys and girls under 14 seem to me much alike, and I can love either equally well. As to any sort of sexual connection between myself and one of my own sex, I cannot think of it otherwise than with disgust. I can imagine great pleasure in having connection with a woman, but their natures do not attract me. Indeed, my liking for my own sex seems to consist almost entirely in a preference for the masculine character, and the feeling that, as an object to look at, the male body is really more beautiful than the female. When any strong temptations to sexual passion come over me in my waking moments, it is of women I think. On the other hand, I have to confess that after being with some lad I love for an hour or two, I have sometimes felt my sexual organs roused, but only once in my life have I experienced a strong desire to sleep in the same bed with a particular lad, and even then no idea of doing anything entered into my mind. Needless to say, I did not sleep with him. I never feel tempted by any girls here, although I see so many with their bodies freely exposed, and plenty of them have really pretty faces. Neither do I feel tempted to do anything improper with any of the boys, although I frequently sit talking with one who has very little on. But I find the constant sight of well-shaped bare limbs has a curious effect on the mind, and comes before one's imagination as a picture at unlooked-for times. But the most curious thing of all is this. There are several lads here of whom I am very fond. Now, when they are near me, I think of them with only the purest and most tender feelings, but sometimes at night, when I am half asleep, or when I am taking my midday siesta, my imagination pictures one of these lads approaching a girl, or actually lying with her, and the strange thing is that I do not feel any desire myself to approach the girl, but I feel I wish I were in her place, and the lad was coming to me. In my calm, waking moments, it disgusts and rather horrifies me to find myself apparently so unsexed. Yet such is the fact, and the experience, with only slight changes, repeats itself over and over again. It is not that I, as a man, wish even in imagination to act improperly with a boy, but I feel I would like to be in the girl's place. And the strange thing is that in all these dreams and imaginings I can always apparently enter into the feelings of the woman better than into those of the man. Sometimes I fancy for a moment that perhaps reincarnation is true, and I was a woman in my last life. Sometimes I fancy that when I was in the womb I was formed as a girl, and the sexual organs changed just at the last moment. It is a curious problem. Don't think I worry about it. Only at long intervals do I think of it. The thing has its bright side. Boys and men seem to have tender feelings toward me, such as one expects them to have for members of the opposite sex, and I get into all the closer contact with them in consequence. History 3. Fr. English, aged 50. Belongs on both sides to healthy normal families of more than average ability. Father was 35 at birth and mother 27. He is the second of 4 children. There was a considerable interval between the births of the children, which were spread over 21 years. All are normal except Fr. 2 of them married and with families. Owing to the difference of age between the children, Fr., who was 3 years younger than his elder brother and more than 4 years older than his sister, the third child, had no male companionship, and was constantly alone with his mother. Being naturally imitative, he remarks, "I think I acquired her tastes and interests and habits of thought. However that may be, I feel sure that my interests and amusements were more girlish than boyish. By way of illustration, I may mention that I have often been told by a friend of my mother's that, on one occasion, I was wanting a new hat, and none being found of a size to fit me, I congratulated myself that I should therefore be obliged to have a bonnet. As regards my feminine tastes and instincts, I have always been conscious of taking interest in questions of family relationships, etiquette, dress, women's as much as or more than men's, and other things of that kind, which as a rule were treated with indifference or contempt. In the house I take more notice than my sister does of the servants' deficiencies and neglects, and am much more orderly in my arrangements than she is. There is nothing markedly feminine in the general appearance. Pubertal development took place at an early age, long before 14, with nocturnal emissions, but without erotic dreams. The testicles are well developed, the penis perhaps rather below the average in size, and the prepuce long and narrow. Erection occurs with much facility, especially at night. When young he knew nothing of masturbation, but he began the habit about 10 years ago, and has practiced it occasionally ever since. Although he likes the society of women to a certain extent, he soon grows tired of it and has never had any desire to marry. His sexual dreams never have any relation to women. "I am generally doing or saying something," he remarks, "to some man whom I know when awake, something which I admit I might wish to do or say if it were not quite out of the question on grounds of propriety and self-respect." He has, however, never had any intimate relationships with men, and much that he has heard of such relationship fills him with horror. "What I feel about myself is," he writes, "that I have to a certain extent, or in some respects, a feminine mind in a male body. Or I might put it that I am a combination of an immoral, in tendency rather than in act, woman, and a religious man. From time to time I have felt strong affection for young men, but I cannot flatter myself that my affection has been reciprocated. At the present time there is a young fellow, 23 years old, who acts as my clerk and sits in my room. He is extremely good-looking, and of a type which is generally considered aristocratic, but so far as I or he know, he is quite of the lower middle class. He has little to recommend him but a fine face and figure, and there is nothing approaching to mental or social equality between us, but I constantly feel the strongest desire to treat him as a man might a young girl he warmly loved. Various obvious considerations keep me from more than quasi-paternal caresses, and I feel sure he would resent very strongly anything more. This constant repression is trying beyond measure to the nerves, and I often feel quite ill from that cause. Having no experiences of my own, I am always anxious to learn anything I can of the sexual relations of other men and their organs, but I have no curiosity whatever concerning the other sex. My chief pleasure and source of gratification is found in the opportunities afforded by Turkish and other baths, wherever, in fact, there is the nude male to be found. But I seldom find in these places anyone who seems to have the same tendency as myself, and certainly I have not met with more than 2 cases among the attendants who responded to my hinted desire to see everything. Under a shampooer, particularly an unfamiliar one, I occasionally experience an orgasm, but less often now than when I was younger. Fr is very short-sighted. His favourite colour is blue, he is able to whistle, his tastes are chiefly of a literary character, and he has never had any liking for sports. I have been generally considered ineffective in the use of my hands, he writes, and I am certainly not skilful. All I have ever been able to do in that way is to knit and do the simpler forms of needlework, but it seems more natural to me to do, or to try to do, everything of that sort, and to play on the piano rather than to shoot or play games. I may add that I am fonder of babies than many women, and am generally considered to be surprisingly capable of holding them. Certainly I enjoy doing so. As a youth I used to act in charades, but I was too shy to do so unless I was dressed as a woman and veiled. When I took a woman's part I felt less like acting than I have done in propriâ persona. A remark made by an uncle once rather annoyed me, that it seemed more like nature than art, but he was quite right. End of Part 2 of Chapter 3. Recording by John Fricker. Part 3 of Chapter 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. History 4. Of Lowland Scotch parentage. Both sides of house healthy and without cerebral or nervous disease. Homosexual desires began at puberty. He practiced onanism to a limited extent at school and up to the age of about 22. His erotic dreams are exclusively about males. While very friendly and intimate with women of all ages, he is instantly repelled by any display of sexual affection on their side. This has happened in varying degree in 3 or 4 cases. With regard to marriage, he remarks, "As there seems no immediate danger of the race dying out, I leave marriage to those who like it." His male ideal has varied to some extent. It has for some years tended toward a healthy, well-developed athletic or out-of-door working type, intelligent and sympathetic, but not specially intellectual. At school his sexual relations were of the simplest type. Since then there have been none. This, he says, is not due either to absence of desire or presence of morals. To put it shortly, there were never the time and the place and the loved one together. In another view, physical desire and the general affection have not always coexisted toward the same person, and the former without the latter is comparatively transient, while the latter stops the gratification of the former if it is felt that the gratification could in any way make the object of affection unhappy mentally or emotionally. He is healthy and fairly well developed, of sensitive emotional nature, but self-controlled. Mentally he is receptive and aggressive by turns, sometimes uncritical, sometimes analytical. His temper is equable, and he is strongly affectionate. Very fond of music and other arts, but not highly imaginative. Of sexual inversion in the abstract he says he has no views, but he thus sums up his moral attitude: I presume that, if it is there for use or abuse, as men please. I condemn gratification of bodily desire at the expense of others, in whatever form it may take. I condemn it no more in its inverted form than in the ordinary. I believe that affection between persons of the same sex, even when it includes the sexual passion and its indulgences, may lead to results as splendid as human nature can ever attain to. In short, I place it on an absolute equality with love as ordinarily understood. History 5. S.W., aged 64, English, musical journalist. The communication which follows, somewhat abbreviated, was written before S.W. had heard or read anything about sexual inversion, and when he still believed that his own case was absolutely unique. I am the son of a clergyman, and lived for the first 13 years of my life in the country town where I was born. Then my father became the vicar of a country village, where I lived until I went out into the world at the age of 18. As during the whole of this time my father had a few pupils, I was educated with them, and never went to school. I was born, I fancy, with sexual passions about as strong as can well be imagined, and at the same time was very precocious in my entry into the stage of puberty. Semen began to form a little before my 12th birthday. Hair soon followed, and in a year I was in that respect the equal of an average boy of 15 or 16. I conversed freely with my companions on the relations of the sexes, but, unlike them, had no personal feeling towards girls. In time I became conscious that I was different, as I then believed, and believe now, from all other men. My sexual organs were quite perfect, but in the frame of a man I had the sexual mind of a female. I distinctly disclaim the faintest inclination to perform unnatural acts. The idea of committing sodomy would be most disgusting. To come to my actual condition of mind, while totally indifferent to the person of woman (I always enjoyed their friendship and companionship, and many of my best friends have been ladies), I had a burning desire to have carnal intercourse with a male, and had the capacity for falling in love, as it is called, to the utmost extent. In imagination I possessed the female organ, and felt toward men exactly as an amorous female would. At the time when I became fully conscious of my condition I attached little importance to it. I had not a notion of its terrible import, nor of the future misery it would entail. All that I had to learn by bitter experience. I did once think of forcing myself to have a connection with a prostitute in order to see whether the actual sensual enjoyment might bring a change, and so have the power to marry, but when it came to thinking over ways and means, my repugnance to the act became so strong that it was quite out of the question. In the case of any male to whom I became attached, I wanted to feel ourselves together, skin to skin, and to be privileged to take such liberties as an amorous female would take if that were all permitted. I sought no purely sensual gratification of any kind. My love was far too genuine for that. During the rather more than half a century which has elapsed since my 12th birthday, I have been genuinely in love about 13 times. I despair attempting to give an idea of the depth and reality of my feelings. I have alluded to my precocity. I was in love when 12 years old, the object being a man of 24, a well-known analytical chemist. He came to my father's house very frequently, and my heart beat almost at the mention of his name. The next serious time I was about 15. It was a farmer's son about 2 years older. I don't think that I was ever alone with him, and really only knew him as a member of his family, yet for a time he was my chief interest in life. When 21 I had a chum, a youth of 17, who entertained for me at any rate a brotherly affection. We were under the same roof, and early one summer morning he got out of bed and came direct to my room to talk about some matter or other. In order to talk more comfortably he got into bed with me, and we lay there just as two schoolgirls might have done. This proximity was more than I could stand, and my heart began to beat so that it was impossible that he should not notice it. As of course he could not have the slightest notion of the reason, he said in all innocence, "Why, how your heart beats. I can hear it quite plainly." So far my details are purely innocent. Up to 18, familiarities passed at intervals between me and the son of the village doctor, youth about 2 years older than myself and precociously immoral. I did not really care for him much, but he was my chief companion. Then I became a school assistant, and for about 6 years managed to control myself, only, alas, to fall again. Another resolution I kept for 8 years, one long fight with my nature. Again I sinned in 3 instances, extending over 3 or 4 years. I now come to a very painful and eventful episode in my unhappy life, which I would gladly pass over were it possible. It was a case in middle life of sin discovery and great folly in addition. Before going into detail, so far as may be necessary, I cannot help asking you to consider calmly and dispassionately my exact condition compared with that of my fellow creatures as a whole. In my struggles to resist in the past, I have at times felt as if wrestling in the folds of a python. I again sinned then with a youth and his friend. Oddly enough, discovery followed through a man who was actuated by a feeling of revenge for a strictly right act on my part. The lads refused to state more than the truth, and this did not satisfy the man, and a third lad was introduced who was prepared to say anything. This was not all. Some 12 or 15 more boys made similar accusations. The general belief, in consequence, was that I had committed nameless crimes in all directions, ad lib. If you were to ask me for an explanation of the action of all these boys beyond the third, who, of course, had some special inducements, I can offer none. They may have thought that the original trio were regarded rather in the light of heroes. Why should they not be heroes too? I might well feel crushed under such a load of accusations, but that does not excuse the incredible folly of my conduct. I denied alike the modicum of truth and the mass of lying, and went off to America. However, as time passed on and my mind got into a proper state, I felt that the truth must be told some time or other. I accordingly wrote from America to the proper quarter a full confession of my sin with regard to the 2 youths who had told merely the truth, at the same time pointing out the falsehood of all the rest of the accusations. I remained in America 6 years, and actually made money so that I could return to England with a small capital. I was also under a promise to my 3 sisters, all older than myself, that I would return in their lifetime. My programme was to purchase a small, light business in London and quietly earn my living, at the same time making my presence known to no one. I did buy such a business, got swindled in the most clever way, and lost every farthing I possessed in the world. I had to make my plight known to old friends, who all either gave or lent me money. Still, my position was a very precarious one. I tried an insurance agency, one of the last resorts of the educated destitute, but soon found out that I was unfitted for work in which impudence is a prime factor. Then an extraordinary stroke of good fortune took place. Almost simultaneously I began to get a few music pupils and literary work in connection with a good musical journal. Making my presence known to old friends involved the same information to those who were not friends. My identity as a journalist became known, and as time passed by it seemed to me as if half the world had heard of my alleged iniquities. People who have never set eyes on me seem to regard me in the light of a monster of iniquity who ought not to be suffered to exist. All these outsiders believe that I have committed nameless offences times innumerable, and lift up their hands in speechless horror at the audacity of a man who, so situated, dares to appear openly in public under his own name and look people in the face. They have not even the brains to see that this very fearlessness proves the fictitious character of their beliefs. Next, they believe that if only they could get my dismissal from my journalistic post, I should be brought to starvation point. This, up to a year ago, was true. Then an old relative died and left me some property, which I sold to invest in an annuity, and thus have just enough to live on quietly, apart from what I may earn. Under such strange conditions, it might be asked whether life was not unendurable. Frankly speaking, I cannot say that I find it so. I have in London a few bachelor friends who go with me to theatres, etc. In the suburbs I have about half a dozen family friends. Here I meet with pleasant society and a hearty welcome. I am passionately fond of music, have an excellent piano, and can hear the best concerts in Europe. I go to all good plays. I am a good chess player. Lastly, I am an omnivorous reader. You will allow that my resources for passing the time are not limited. Of course, I am sorry that I sinned, and wish that I had not done so, but I disclaim any feeling of shame. S.W. was the youngest of 4 children and the only boy. His father was 40 at his birth, his mother 33. The father was an intellectual man of weak character, the mother a woman of violent and eccentric temper with, he believes, strong sexual passions. S.W. knows of nothing in the family to account for his own abnormal condition. He is short, 5 feet 5 inches, but well built, with strong chest and a powerful voice. His arms are weak and flabby, feminine, he thinks, but the legs muscular. As a boy of 14 he could walk 40 miles with ease, and he played football till near the age of 45. He is considered manly in character and tastes, but is easily moved to tears under strong excitement. There is no information as to the type of man to whom he is attracted. I may observe, however, that the analytical chemist who first evoked S.W.'s admiration was well known to me some 30 years later, as he was my own teacher in chemistry. At that time he was an elderly man of attractive appearance and character, sympathetic and winning in manner to an almost feminine extent. S.W. has never felt the slightest sexual attraction toward the opposite sex. The first indications of inverted feeling were at the age of 6 or 7. Watching his father's pupils, boys of 13 or 14, from the windows, he speculated on what their organs of generation were like. In connection with a girl, he writes, I should no more have thought of such a thing than in the case of a block of marble. About this time, indeed, he at times slept with a sister of 10 who induced him to go through the form of sexual connection, saying that it felt "so funny," but he merely did this to please her, and without the slightest interest or feeling on his own part. This attitude became more marked with increased knowledge, until he fell ardently in love at the age of 12. Throughout life he has practised masturbation to a certain extent, and is prepared to defend the practice in his own case. His erotic dreams have been of only the vaguest and most shadowy character. He is able to whistle. He takes a warm interest in politics and in philanthropic work, but his chief love is for music, and he has published many musical compositions. On the whole, and notwithstanding the persecution he has endured, he does not regard his life as unhappy. At the same time, he is keenly conscious of the atmosphere of pariahdom which surrounds inverts, and in his own case this has never been alleviated by any sense of companionship in misery. The facility with which some inverts are said to recognize others of their own kind is quite incomprehensible to him. He has never, to his knowledge, met one. History 6. E.S. Physician. Aged 50. I have some reason, he writes, for believing that some of my relatives on the paternal side were not normal in their sexual life, but I am sure that no such suspicion was entertained by their friends or associates. They were very reticent people. A great proportion of my near relatives have remained unmarried or deferred marriage until later in life. None of them have been good business men. All seem to have been more deeply concerned in other things than in making or in keeping money. They have mostly taken little or no share in public life, and not cared much for society. Yet they have been folk of more than average ability, with intellectual and aesthetic interests. We are prone to enthusiasms, but lack perseverance. We are discursive and superficial, perhaps, but none would call us stupid. We are perhaps abnormally self-centered and self-conscious, never cruel or vicious. Our powers of self-control are considerable. We are conventional people only because we are lazy and intensely dislike any open self-assertion. Yet we are nervous rather than phlegmatic. All that is on the father's side. My maternal ancestors have been concerned with farming and the sea, and have also had a similar lack of business capacity, but with less mental adaptiveness and alertness, with more steadiness of purpose, however, always doers rather than dreamers. Among them I remember one cousin who was probably abnormal, although he died when I was too young to notice much. Again, they were all rather reserved people, but more genial with strangers, more socially inclined, and with less self-control. I was an only child and a spoilt one. I was always quick at school, fond of learning and finding my lessons no trouble. Serious study I disliked, but for school purposes I did not find it necessary, and had no difficulty in carrying all before me. I was never fond of games, although very fond of being out of doors and of walking. Few of my relatives have been at all keen on sport. I made no close friendships at school, and was never very popular with my schoolfellows, who, however, tolerated my odd ways better than might have been expected. I was easily brought to appreciate good literature, but I never had much power of expression or of strenuous thought. I was extremely susceptible and impressible, moved by beauty of any kind, but never at all ambitious or in any way creative. I was easily stimulated to work, and then loved to work, but unless the stimulus were maintained, the natural indolence of my disposition asserted itself, and I wasted my powers in dreams and trifles. My memory was very quick and retentive, in the main, but curiously capricious. I always lacked initiative and decision. At college my successes were continued. I gained medals and prizes, passed my examinations easily, and graduated with first-class honours. In my professional life work I have been successful rather beyond the average. I love it with all my heart. I cannot speak with any confidence about the first stirrings of my sexual instincts, but I think I can assert that they have at no time led me to any desire for the opposite sex. It is true that my earliest recollection of the kind is concerned with intimacies with a girl playfellow, but as we had at the time reached only the mature age of 7 at the most, I fancy that our mutual exhibitions, for there was nothing more, simply satisfied our natural curiosity. Certainly these memories are in my mind in no way set apart from the recollections of other kinds of play. Next to that I remember the usual schoolboy talk about things hidden and forbidden, but up till I was 12 or so this was simply dirty talk, concerned more with renal and intestinal functions than with any sexual feelings or understanding. One boy was known to us all, and of my not inconsiderable circle of early friends all grew up to be normal people who married and had children in due course, for the unusual size of his parts, and for the freedom with which he invited and satisfied the curiosity of his friends. He must have been precocious, for he could not have been more than 12, and I remember to have heard that he had a thick growth of pubic hair. Even then, although I know that my curiosity, to put it at that only, was active, I never allowed myself to have any dealings with him, and I think I should have discouraged them had they been suggested to me. That is the odd thing about my life. The things I longed intensely to do I would not let myself do, not from any religious or moral scruple, but from some inexplicable fastidiousness or scrupulosity which is yet as active as ever, although I am sure that it would not be able to hold its own could these favourable conditions be repeated, but would be overcome by the imperious and fully grown desires which by long repression or by unsatisfactory diversion have grown to be so strong. Indeed, given the opportunity and the assurance that no first seduction or corruption of any one was in question, they would prove quite irrepressible. Certainly, long before puberty, which was early with me, I remember being greatly attracted to certain boys and wishing to have an opportunity of sleeping with them. Had I been able to do so, I am sure I should have been impelled to get into as close contact with their naked body as possible, and I do not think I should then have craved for anything more. I knew some boys, perhaps a little older, who even then had relations, which were certainly not innocent, with a girl who was a year or two older than any of us. She once kissed me, to my intense shame, but I felt that these relations would have been unspeakably disgusting, and I took no particular interest in hearing about them. I remember being fondled and caressed by a very good-looking boy of 16 when I was 3 or 4 years younger, and had sustained some hurt at play, and I am still able to recall the thrill of delight that I experienced at his touch. Nothing took place that all the world might not have seen, but I remember being taken between his knees as he sat, and his arms being put around my neck, and the warm soft pressure of his thighs had an unspeakable effect on me. About this time, too, an older boy, perhaps about 18, used to get hold of smaller boys when on country walks to throw them down and then look at and toy with their genitals. He was himself a handsome boy, and I was greatly excited when told about this by boys who had experienced it, and wished greatly to have it done to me. It never was, and if it had been attempted I know I should have resisted with all my strength, although my desires would have set me aflame. This boy died before he was 20 with a psoas abscess, and I remember crying myself to sleep the night I learned of his death. Another boy about 3 years older than myself, who had very silky hair, I used to be attracted by, and I was always trying to stroke his hair, but he always objected. I must have been about 12 when I was first taught to masturbate by a cousin who was slightly older. At first I thought it silly, but I used to watch him at it and practiced it myself from time to time until I became old enough to experience the proper sensation. Then I have reason to think I gave myself up to it rather freely, but it was generally done in solitude, although it was long before I realized that there was anything wrong about it or that it might prove hurtful. Looking back now, I feel perfectly certain that my instincts were wholly homosexual from the very first. This cousin, who possessed notable intellectual and artistic gifts, married, but I feel sure his liking for his own sex was not normal. With another cousin, almost years my junior, I was always on terms of the most affectionate intimacy. My holidays at his parents' house were my greatest delight. We were always together by night or day. We slept in the same bed, literally in each other's arms. To me it afforded the keenest sexual pleasure to press close to his naked body. We used mutually to handle and caress our parts, but without any attempt at mutual masturbation, although at that period I regularly practiced it on myself. I asked him once about it, but he had not been taught it by others, and to my great pride and satisfaction I can say that I never either did it to him or asked him to do it to me. This I mention as an instance of my restraint in acts, although my thoughts and desires knew no such curb. I remember also an elder brother of his, perhaps 3 or 4 years my senior, once showing me, then about 12 I suppose, his semi-erect penis. He would not allow me to touch it, but showed me how to draw back the foreskin so as to uncover the glans. His penis was large, and the incident was not forgotten. We had no other relation, and I know that both he and my own friend grew up to be quite normal men. I think I must have been about 17 when I got frightened about the occurrence of nocturnal emissions, which I believed were the evil result of masturbation, and for 2 or 3 years I continued in considerable mental distress until, when in my 2nd or 3rd year at college, I summoned up courage enough to consult our good old family doctor, who reassured me, but made, I now think, too light of my confidences, so that I relapsed the more readily, although much later on, into old habits. From our windows at home we looked over a bit of common or down to the beach, and I used to keep watch on warm summer afternoons over boys who might be bathing, to observe them through our telescope. All this I kept strictly secret, and I was never surprised. I might just as well, and without arousing the slightest suspicion of my motive, have walked down to the beach and seen them and chatted with them, but this I could not have brought myself to do. It gave me considerable sexual satisfaction when I was able to see them bathing without pants. I also used to watch them at play on the common, and felt rewarded when I saw, as I not infrequently did, sexual familiarities taking place. These violently excited me, and sometimes brought on orgasm, always erection with pleasure. Indeed, it was an experience of this kind that made me return to masturbation after I had given it up for a while. I remember one day seeing 2 lads of about 16 lying on the grass in the sunshine. All at once the bigger lad put out his hand and tried to open his companion's trousers. He resisted with all his might, and a long struggle ensued, ending in the smaller lad having his penis exposed and manipulated by the other. Even at this day the recollection of this excites me. Both lads grew up to be normal men. Twice only have I been approached by grown-up people. When I was about 13 I used to meet often, when going to school by train, an old gentleman who courted me, as it were, used often to talk to me and ask me to come to see his well-known scientific collections, but I always had a vague distrust of him and never went. One day in the summer, during a spare hour, I met him in an empty room in the museum, where there were usually very few visitors at that time of day, and where large show-cases gave concealment. He came up to me and told me he had been away in the country, and that when making his way home through hedges and thorny bushes, some of the thorns got stuck amongst his clothes and were still giving him uneasiness. I would be grateful, he said, if you would put your hand down and try if you can feel any thorns sticking in my underflannels, and pull them out. He then unbuttoned his braces on one side, undid his trousers, and made me thrust my hand over his groin and lower abdomen. I avoided touching his genitals, but he pushed my hand down in that direction until, burning with shame, I made my escape and ran off, not stopping until I was safe in school. I scarcely understood it, but never spoke of it, and avoided him ever afterward. I learned later on that he was a well-off bachelor who took a great interest in working lads and young men, and did much to help them on in life and keep them, so it was said, from falling into bad company. He died at a great age and left most of his fortune to an institution for lads, as well as large legacies to youths in whom he had been interested. The other time was on top of a tram-car, when a grown-up man who was near pressed as close to me as he could, began to talk, praised my dark eyes, then put his hand on my thigh under my loose cloak, and felt upward toward my parts. At the same time he took hold of my hand, caressed it, and put it over his parts. It was in the dusk. This excited me, and if we had not been at our destination, I think I would gladly have permitted further familiarities. He tried to ask me where I lived, but there was no time to answer, and the female relative who was with me on another seat would no doubt have prevented this from having any further sequel. On more than one occasion I have experienced the sexual orgasm as a result of mental anxiety. The first time this occurred was when I was hurrying to avoid being late for school. Another time when I was about 24 and was extremely anxious to fill an appointment for which I was late. So copious was the omission that I had to go home and change. As a medical student, the first reference bearing definitely on the subject of sexual inversion was made in the class of medical jurisprudence, where certain sexual crimes were alluded to, very summarily and inadequately, but nothing was said of the existence of sexual inversion as the normal condition of certain unhappy people, nor was any distinction drawn between the various non-normal acts, which were all classed together as manifestations of the criminal depravity of ordinary or insane people. To a student beginning to be acutely conscious that his sexual nature differed profoundly from that of his fellows, nothing could be more perplexing and disturbing, and it shut me up more completely in my reserve than ever. I felt that this teaching must be based on some radical error or prejudice or misapprehension, for I knew from my own very clear remembrance of my own development that my peculiarity was not acquired, but inborn, my great misfortune undoubtedly, but not my fault. It was still more unfortunate that in the course of the lectures on clinical medicine there was not the slightest allusion to the subject. All sorts of rare diseases, some of which I have not yet met with in the course of 21 years of a busy practice, were fully discussed, but we were left entirely ignorant of a subject so vitally important to me personally and, as it seems to me, to the profession to which I aspired. There might have been an incidental reference to masturbation, although I do not remember it, but its real significance received no attention, and what we students knew of it was the result of our reading or of our personal experiences. In the class of mental disease there was naturally more detailed and systematic reference to facts in the sexual life and to sexual inversion as a rare pathological condition, but still there was not a comforting word to reassure me, growing ever more hopelessly ashamed of what it seemed was a criminal or a gravely morbid nature. Among all my fellow students I knew of no one constituted like myself, but my natural reserve, increased of course by my consciousness of what I saw would be thought to be a criminal tendency, did not urge me to exchange of confidences or to the formation of close friendships. After graduation I became a resident medical officer in the hospital and private assistant to one of the professors, a physician and teacher of world-wide reputation. With him I associated on the most cordial and affectionate terms, and often in the course of conversation I tried to bring him to discuss the subject, but without success. It was obviously unpleasant and uninteresting to him. Enough was said, however, to enable me to realize that he held the current ideas on the subject, and I would not for worlds have allowed him to guess that I myself came under the despised and tainted category. I have seldom heard sexual inversion discussed among my professional friends. They speak of it with disgust or amusement. I have never met a professional man who would consider it dispassionately or scientifically. For them it was a subject entirely belonging to psychological medicine. I have had no admitted cases of it among my patients, but I have often instinctively felt that some who consulted me about other matters would have taken me into their confidence about that, but for their fear of being cruelly misunderstood. As to my moral attitude, I fear to speak. Grossness disgusts me, but I am not sure that I should be able to resist temptation placed in my way. But I am absolutely sure that I should never, under any circumstances, tempt others to any disgraceful act. If I had ever committed any sexual act with one of my own sex whom I loved, I could not look at it or approach it in any other than a sacramental way. This sounds blasphemous and shocking, but I cannot otherwise express my meaning. As regards the marriage of inverts, my own feeling is that for a congenital invert, no matter how fully the situation be explained beforehand, it is a step fraught with too great possibilities of tragedy and of the deepest unhappiness to be advised at all. My view is that for the invert, far more than for the ordinary person, there is no escape from the supreme necessity of self-control in any relationship he may form. If that be attained, then the ideal is a relationship with another man of similar temperament, not a platonic one necessarily, by means of which the highest happiness of both may be reached, but this can occur very seldom. To poetry and the fine arts I am very susceptible, and I have given a great deal of time to this study. I am devoted heart and soul to music, which is more and more to me every year I live. Trivial or light music I cannot endure, but of Beethoven, Bach, Handel, Schumann, Schubert, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, and Wagner I should never hear enough. Here, too, my sympathies are very Catholic, and I delight in MacDowell, Debussy, Richard Strauss, and Hugo Wolf. End of Part 3 of Chapter 3. Recording by John Fricker. Part 4 of Chapter 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. History 7. My parentage is very sound and healthy. Both my parents, who belong to the professional middle class, have good general health, nor can I trace any marked abnormal or diseased tendency of mind or body in any records of the family. Though of a strongly nervous temperament myself, and sensitive, my health is good. I am not aware of any tendency to physical disease. In early manhood, however, owing, I believe, to the great emotional tension under which I lived, my nervous system was a good deal shattered and exhausted. Mentally and morally my nature is pretty well balanced, and I have never had any serious perturbations in these departments. At the age of 8 or 9, and long before distinct sexual feelings declared themselves, I felt a friendly attraction toward my own sex, and this developed after the age of puberty into a passionate sense of love, which, however, never found any expression for itself till I was fully 20 years of age. I was a day boarder at school, and heard little of school talk on sex subjects, was very reserved and modest besides. No elder person or parent ever spoke to me on such matters, and the passion for my own sex developed gradually, utterly uninfluenced from the outside. I never even during all this period, and till a good deal later, learned the practice of masturbation. My own sexual nature was a mystery to me. I found myself cut off from the understanding of others, felt myself an outcast, and with a highly loving and clinging temperament was intensely miserable. I thought about my male friends, sometimes boys of my own age, sometimes elder boys, and once even a master, during the day, and dreamed about them at night, but was too convinced that I was a hopeless monstrosity ever to make any effectual advances. Later on it was much the same, but gradually, though slowly, I came to find that there were others like myself. I made a few special friends, and at last it came to me occasionally to sleep with them, and to satisfy my imperious need by mutual embraces and emissions. Before this happened, however, I was once or twice on the brink of despair and madness with repressed passion and torment. Meanwhile, from the first, my feeling, physically, toward the female sex was one of indifference, and later on, with the more special development of sex desires, one of positive repulsion. Though having several female friends whose society I like, and to whom I am sincerely attached, the thought of marriage or cohabitation with any such has always been odious to me. As a boy I was attracted in general by boys rather older than myself. After leaving school I still fell in love, in a romantic vein, with comrades of my own standing. Now, at the age of 37, my ideal of love is a powerful, strongly built man of my own age, or rather younger, preferably of the working class, though having solid sense and character. He need not be specially intellectual. If endowed in the latter way, he must not be too glib or refined. Anything effeminate in a man, or anything of the cheap intellectual style, repels me very decisively. I have never had to do with actual pederasty, so called. My chief desire in love is bodily nearness or contact, as to sleep naked with a naked friend. The specially sexual, though urgent enough, seems a secondary matter. Pederasty, either active or passive, might seem in place to me with one I loved very devotedly, and who also loved me to that degree, but I think not otherwise. I am an artist by temperament and choice, fond of all beautiful things, especially the male human form, of active, slight, muscular build, and sympathetic but somewhat indecisive character, though possessing self-control. I cannot regard my sexual feelings as unnatural or abnormal, since they have disclosed themselves so perfectly naturally and spontaneously within me. All that I have read in books or heard spoken about the ordinary sexual love, its intensity and passion, lifelong devotion, love at first sight, etc., seems to me to be easily matched by my own experiences in the homosexual form, and with regard to the morality of this complex subject, my feeling is that it is the same as should prevail in love between man and woman, namely, that no bodily satisfaction should be sought at the cost of another person's distress or degradation. I am sure that this kind of love is, notwithstanding the physical difficulties that attend it, as deeply stirring and ennobling as the other kind, if not more so, and I think that for a perfect relationship the actual sex gratifications, whatever they may be, probably hold a less important place in this love than in the other. History 8. M.N. Aged 30. My grandfather might be said to be of abnormal temperament, for, though of very humble origin, he organized and carried out an extremely arduous mission work, and became an accomplished linguist, translating the Bible into an Eastern tongue and compiling the first dictionary of that language. He died, practically of overwork, at the age of 45. He was twice married, my father being his third son by the second wife. I believe that 2, if not more, of the family, numbering 7 in all, were inverted, and the only one of them to marry was my father. My grandmother was the last representative of an old and very wild Irish family. She died at an advanced age of paralysis. My father was 36 and my mother 21 at the time of their marriage. I was born 3 years after and was their only child. The marriage proved a most unhappy one, they being utterly unsuited to each other in every way. My father's health during the first years of his marriage was very delicate, and I have reason to believe that it had been undermined in certain ways by his life abroad. I understand I was born with slight gonorrheal affection, and as a child my health was very indifferent. This latter may have been brought about by the peculiarly unhappy and unnatural life I led. I had no companions of my own age and did not even attend any school until after my mother's death. My father superintended my education up to that time, and I had free access to a large and very varied library and a great deal of solitary leisure to enjoy it in. There were a number of medical and scientific books in it which were my principal favorites, and I remember deciding at a very early age to be a doctor. When about 5 years old I recollect having a sexual dream connected with a railway porter. It afforded me great pleasure to recall this dream, and about that time I discovered a method of self-gratification. There is not much teaching required in these matters. I cannot say that the dream I have mentioned constituted absolutely the first intimation of inverted feeling, but rather that it crystallized vague ideas which I might have already had on the subject. I can recollect that when about between 3 and 4 years of age, a young fellow of about 20 came to our house several times as a visitor. He was fond of children, I suppose, and I generally sat on his knee and was kissed by him. This was a source of great pleasure to me, but I cannot remember if it was accompanied by erection. I can only recall that his attention and caresses made a greater impression upon me than those of women. When about that age, too, I was often aroused when sleeping with my mother, and told not to lie on my face. I remember that erection was always present on these occasions. The dream was the first of many of its kind, and in my case they have never been accompanied by emission. They have always been of an inverted character, though I have occasionally had dreams about women. These latter, however, have usually partaken somewhat of the nature of a nightmare. Up to the age of 14 I felt much perplexed and depressed by my views on sexual desire, and was convinced that they were peculiar to myself. This, combined with the solitary condition of my life and about 4 years' continued ill treatment prior to my mother's death (she had given way to drink for that period), had a very injurious effect on my health, mental and bodily. Looking back from my present point of view, I can understand and forgive many things which appeared monstrous and unjust to me as a child. My mother's life must have been a very unhappy one, and she was bitterly disappointed in many ways, very likely in me as well. My unfortunate misunderstood temperament led me to be shy and secretive, and I was often ailing, and my training was not calculated to improve matters. At last, however, change and freedom came, and I was sent to a boarding school. Here, of course, I soon met with attachments and gratifications with other boys. I arrived at puberty, and my health improved under happier surroundings. I was not long in discovering that my companions viewed the pleasures that meant so much to me from an entirely different standpoint. Their gratifications were usually accompanied by conversation about and a general direction of thought toward females. When I had turned 15, owing to monetary difficulties, I was obliged to leave school, and was soon not only thrown on my own resources, but accountable to no one but myself for my conduct. Of course, my next discovery was that my case, so far from being peculiar, was a most common one, and I was quickly initiated into all the mysteries of inversion, with its freemasonry and argot. Altogether, my experience of inverts has been a pretty wide and varied one, and I have always endeavored to classify and compare cases which have come under my notice with a view to arriving at some sort of conclusion or explanation. I suppose it is due to female versatility or impressibility that it is possible for me to experience mentally the emotions attributable to either sex, according to the age and temperament of my companion. For instance, with one older than myself, possessing well-marked male characteristics, I am able to feel all that surrender and dependence which is so essentially feminine. On the other hand, if with a youth of feminine type and behavior I can realize, with an equal amount of pleasure, the tender yet dominant attitude of the male. I experience no particular horror of women sexually. I should imagine that my feeling toward them resembles very much what normal people feel with regard to others of their own sex. M.N. remarks that he cannot whistle, and that his favorite color is green. In this case the subject easily found a moral modus vivendi with his inverted instinct, and he takes its gratification for granted. In the following case, which I believe is typical of a large group, the subject has never yielded to his inverted impulses, and, except so far as masturbation is concerned, has preserved strict chastity. History 9. R.S., aged 31, American of French descent. Upon the question of heredity, I may say that I belong to a reasonably healthy, prolific, and long-lived family. On my father's side, however, there is a tendency toward pulmonary troubles. He himself died of pneumonia, and 2 of his brothers and a nephew of consumption. Neither of my parents were morbid or eccentric. Except for a certain shyness with strangers, my father was a very masculine man. My mother is somewhat nervous, but is not imaginative nor at all demonstrative in her affections. I think that my own imaginative and artistic temperament must come from my father's side. Perhaps my French ancestry has something to do with it. With the exception of my maternal grandfather, all my progenitors have been of French descent. My mother's father was English. I possess a mercurial temperament and a strong sense of the ludicrous. Though my physique is slight, my health has always been excellent. Of late years especially I have been greatly given to introspection and self-scrutiny, but have never had any hallucinations, mental delusions, nor hysterics, and am not at all superstitious. Spiritualistic manifestations, hypnotic dabblings, and the other psychical fads of the day have little or no attraction for me. In fact, I have always been skeptical of them, and they rather bore me. At school I was an indolent, dreamy boy, shirking study, but otherwise fairly docile to my teachers. From earliest childhood I have indulged in omnivorous taste for reading, my particular likings being for travels, aesthetics, metaphysical and theological subjects, and more recently for poetry and certain forms of mysticism. I never cared much for history or for scientific subjects. From the beginning, too, I showed a strong artistic bent and possessed an overpowering love for all things beautiful. As a child I was passionately fond of flowers, loved to be in the woods and alone, and wanted to become an artist. My parents opposed the latter wish, and I gave way before their opposition. In me the homosexual nature is singularly complete and is undoubtedly congenital. The most intense delight of my childhood, even when a tiny boy in a nurse's charge, was to watch acrobats and riders at the circus. This was not so much for the skillful feats as on account of the beauty of their persons. Even then I cared chiefly for the more lithe and graceful fellows. People told me that circus actors were wicked and would steal little boys, and so I came to look upon my favorites as half devil and half angel. When I was older and could go about alone, I would often hang around the tents of traveling shows in hope of catching a glimpse of the actors. I longed to see them naked without their tights, and used to lie awake at night thinking of them and longing to be loved and embraced by them. A certain bareback rider, a sort of jockey, used especially to please me on account of his handsome legs, which were clothed in fleshlings up to his waist, leaving his beautiful loins uncovered by a breech clout. There was nothing consciously sensual about these reveries, because at the time I had no sensual feelings or knowledge. Curiously enough, the women actors repelled me then, as they do to this day, quite as strongly as I was attracted by the men. I used also to take great pleasure in watching men and boys in swimming, but my opportunities for seeing them thus were extremely rare. I never dared let my comrades know how I felt about these matters, but the sight of a well-formed naked youth or man would fill me, and does now, with mingled feelings of bashfulness, anguish, and delight. I used to tell myself endless stories of a visionary castle inhabited by beautiful boys, one of whom was especially my dear chum. It was always the prince in fairy tales who held my interest or affection. I was constantly falling in love with handsome boys whom I never knew, nor did I ever try to mix in their company, for I was abashed before them, and had no liking nor aptitude for boyish games. Sometimes I played with girls, because they were more quiet and gentler, but I cared for them little or not at all. As is usually the case, my parents neglected to impart to me any sexual knowledge, and such as I possessed was gathered furtively from tainted sources, bad boys' talk at school and elsewhere. My elders let me know in a vague way that talk of the kind was wicked, and natural timidity and a wish to be good kept me from learning much about sexual matters. As I never went to boarding school, I was spared perhaps many of the degrading initiations administered by knowing boys at such institutions. In spite of what has been said above, I do not believe that I was sexually very precocious, and even now I feel that more pleasure would ensue from merely contemplating than from personal contact with the object of my amorous attentions. As I grew older there came, of course, an undefined physical longing, but it was the beauty of those I admired which mainly appealed to me. At the time of puberty I spontaneously acquired the habit of masturbation. Once, while bathing, I found that a pleasant feeling came while touching the sexual organs. It was not long before I was confirmed in the habit. At first I practiced it but seldom, but afterward much more frequently, say once a week, though at times months have elapsed without any indulgences on my part. I have only had erotic dreams 3 or 4 times in my life. The masturbation habit I regard as morally reprehensible, and have made many resolutions to break it, but without avail. It affords me only the most momentary satisfaction, and is always followed by remorseful scruples. I have never in my life had any sexual feeling for a woman, nor any sexual connection with any woman whatsoever. The very thought of such a thing is excessively repugnant and disgusting to me. This is true apart from any moral considerations, and I do not think I could bring myself to it. I am not attracted by young women in any way. Even their physical beauty has little or no charm for me, and I often wonder how men can be so affected by it. On the other hand, I am not a woman hater and have several strong friends of the opposite sex. They are, however, women older than myself, and our friendship is based solely on certain intellectual or aesthetic tastes we have in common. I have had practically no physical relations with men, at any rate none specifically sexual. Once, when about 19 or 21, I started to embrace a beautifully formed youth with whom I was sleeping, but timidity and scruples got the better of my feelings, and, as my bedfellow was not amorously inclined toward me, nothing came of it. A few years after this I became strongly attached to a friend whom I had already known for several years. Circumstances threw us very much together during one summer. It was now that I felt for the first time the full shock of love. He returned my affection, but both of us were shy of showing our feelings or speaking of them. Often when walking together after nightfall we would put our arms about each other. Sometimes, too, when sleeping together we would lie in close contact, and my friend once suggested that I put my legs against his. He frequently begged me to spend the night with him, but I began to fear my feelings and slept with him but seldom. We neither of us had any definite ideas about homosexual relations, and apart from what I have related above, we had no further contact with each other. A few months after our amorous feelings had developed my friend died. His death caused me great distress, and my naturally religious temperament began to manifest itself quite strongly. At this time, too, I first read some writings of Mr. Addington Symonds, and certain allusions in his work, coupled with my recent experience, soon stirred me to a full consciousness of my inverted nature. About 8 months after my friend's death, I happened to meet in a strange town a youth of about my own age who exerted upon me a strong and instant attraction. He possessed a refined, handsome face, was gracefully built, and though he was rather undemonstrative, we soon became fast friends. We were together only for a few days when I was obliged to leave for my home, and the parting caused me great unhappiness and depression. A few months after we spent a vacation together. One day during our trip we went swimming and undressed in the same bathhouse. When I saw my friend naked for the first time he seemed to me so beautiful that I longed to throw my arms about him and cover him with kisses. I kept my feelings hidden, however, hardly daring to look at him for fear of being unable to restrain my desires. Several times afterward in his room I saw him stripped, with the same effect upon my emotions. Until I had seen him naked, my feelings for him were not of a physical character, but afterward I longed for actual contact, but only by embraces and kisses. Though he was fond of me, he had absolutely no amorous longings for me, and, being a simple, pure-minded fellow, would have loathed me for mine and my inverted nature. I was careful never to let him discover it, and I was made very unhappy when he confided that he was in love with a young girl whom he wished to marry. This episode took place several years ago, and though we are still friends, my emotional feelings for him have cooled considerably. I have always been very shy of showing any affectionate tendencies. Most of my acquaintances, and close friends even, think me curiously cold, and often wonder why I have never fallen in love or married. For obvious reasons, I have never been able to tell them. 3 or 4 years ago a little book by Coventry Patmore fell into my hands, and from its perusal resulted a strange blending of my religious and erotic notions. The desire to love and be loved is hard to drown, and when I realized that homosexually it was neither lawful nor possible for me to love in this world, I began to project my longings into the next. By birth I am a Roman Catholic, and in spite of a somewhat skeptical temper, manage to remain one by conviction. From the doctrines of the Trinity, Incarnation, and Eucharist, I have drawn conclusions which would fill the minds of the average pietist with holy horror. Nevertheless, I believe that, granting the premises, these conclusions are both logically and theologically defensible. The divinity of my fancied paradise resembles in no way the vapid conceptions of Fra Angelico or the Quartier Saint-Sulpice. His physical aspect, at least, would be better represented by some Praxitelean demigod or Flandrin's naked brooding boy. While these imaginings have caused me considerable moral disquietude, they do not seem wholly reprehensible, because I feel that the chief happiness I would derive by their realization would be mainly from the contemplation of the loved one, rather than from closer joys. I possess only a slight knowledge of the history and particulars of erotic mysticism, but it is likely that my notions are neither new nor peculiar, and many utterances of the few mystical writers with whose works I am acquainted seem substantially in accord with my own longings and conclusions. In endeavoring to find for them some sanction of valid authority, I have always sought corroboration from members of my own sex. Hence am less likely to have fashioned my views after those of hypersensitive or hysterical women. You will rightly infer that it is difficult for me to say exactly how I regard morally the homosexual tendency. Of this much, however, I am certain, that, even if it were possible, I would not exchange my inverted nature for a normal one. I suspect that the sexual emotions, and even inverted ones, have a more subtle significance than is generally attributed to them. But modern moralists either fight shy of transcendental interpretations or see none, and I am ignorant and unable to solve the mystery these feelings seem to imply. Patmore speaks boldly enough in his way, and Lacordaire has hinted at things, but in a very guarded manner. I have neither the ability nor opportunity to study what the mystics of the Middle Ages have to say along these lines, and besides, the medieval way of looking at things is not congenial to me. The chief characteristic of my tendency is an overpowering admiration for male beauty, and in this I am more akin to the Greeks. I have absolutely no words to tell you how powerfully such beauty affects me. Moral and intellectual worth is, I know, of greater value, but physical beauty I see more clearly, and it appears to me the most vivid, if not the most perfect, manifestation of the divine. A little incident may perhaps reveal to you my feelings more completely. Not long ago I happened to see an unusually well-formed young fellow enter a house of assignation with a common woman of the street. The sight filled me with the keenest anguish, and the thought that his beauty would soon be at the disposal of a prostitute made me feel as if I were a powerless and an unhappy witness to a sacrilege. It may be that my rage for male loveliness is only another outbreaking of the old Platonic mania, for as time goes on I find that I long less for the actual youth before me and more for some ideal, perfect being whose bodily splendor and loving heart are the realities whose reflections only we see in this cave of shadows. Since the birth and development within me of what, for lack of a better name, I term my homosexualized Patmorian ideal, life has become, in the main, a weary business. I am not despondent, however, because many things still hold for me a certain interest. When that interest dies down, as it is wont from time to time, I endeavor to be patient. God grant that, after the end here, I may be drawn from the shadow and seemingly vain imaginings into the possession of their never-ending reality hereafter. End of Part 4 of Chapter 3. Recording by John Fricker. Part 5 of Chapter 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. History 10. A.H., aged 62, belongs to a family which cannot be regarded as healthy, but there is no insanity among near relations. Father, a very virile man of high character and good intelligence, but not sound physical health. Mother was high-strung and nervous, but possessed of indomitable courage and very affectionate. She lived very happily with her husband. She became a chronic invalid and died of consumption. A.H. was a 7 months child, the third in the family, who were born very rapidly, so that there is only 3 years' difference in the ages of the first and third children. A.H. believes that one of his brothers, who has never married and prefers men to women, is also inverted, though not to the same degree as himself, and he also suspects that a relation of his mother's may have been an invert. Sister, who resembles the father in character, is married, but is spoken of as a woman's woman rather than a man's woman.
The family generally are considered proud and reserved, but of superior mental endowment. In early life, A.H. was delicate, and his studies were often interrupted by illness. Though living under happy conditions, he was shy and nervous, often depressed. In later life his health has been up to the average, and he has usually been able to conceal his mental doubts and diffidence. As a child he played with dolls and made girls his companions until an age when he grew conscious that his conduct was unusual and became ashamed, while his father seemed troubled about him. He regards himself as having been a very childish child. His conscious sexual life began between the ages of 8 and 10. He was playing in the garden when he saw a manservant who had long been with the family standing at the door of a shed with his penis exposed and erect. The boy had never seen anything of the kind before, but felt great delight in the exhibition, and moved shyly toward the man, who retreated into the shed. The boy followed, and was allowed to caress and play with the penis until ejaculation took place, the man replying, in reply to the child's innocent inquiries, that it felt good. This experience was frequently repeated with the same man, and the boy confided in a boy friend, with whom he tried to ascertain by personal experience what the good feeling was like, but they were too young to derive any pleasure from the attempt beyond the joy of what was instinctively felt to be eating forbidden fruit. From this period his sexual tendencies began to become fixed and self-conscious. He has never, at any period of life, had a moment's conscious sexual attraction toward a person of the opposite sex. His warmest friendships have, indeed, been with women, and much, perhaps most, of the happiness he has enjoyed has been furnished by those friendships. But passion has only been aroused by persons of his own sex, generally by men much younger than himself. He feels shy and uncomfortable in the presence of men of his own age, but even at his present age a touch of a man or boy may cause the liveliest gratification. Shortly after the incident in boyhood already narrated, A.H. induced a little boy companion to go to a quiet spot, where at A.H.'s suggestion each placed the other's penis in his mouth by turns. A.H. had never heard of such a proceeding. It was a natural instinct. He began to masturbate at an early age, but he soon found a companion to share his passion. An older man, especially, married and with a family, became his accomplice on every possible opportunity, and they would manipulate each other. At the age of 21, fellatio began to be practiced with this man. It became a lifelong practice, and the preferred method of sexual gratification. He likes best to have it performed on himself, but he has never asked anyone to do for him what he would not himself do for the other if desired. There has never been pedicatio. The penis, it may be added, is of good size, and the testicles rather large. No one has ever suspected A.H.'s sexual perversion, not even his physician, with whom he has long had a close friendship, until at a time of great mental distress A.H. voluntarily revealed his state. He is accustomed to refined society, has always read much, abhorred athletic pursuits, and loved poetry, children, and flowers. His love of nature amounts indeed to a passion. Wherever he has been he has made friends among the best people. He confesses to occasional periods of addiction to intoxicants, induced by sociable companionship, and only controlled by force of will. For business he has not the slightest aptitude, and cannot look after his own affairs. He is always dreading poverty and destitution. He believes, however, that he passes among his friends as fairly capable. He considers that inversion is natural in his case, and that he has a perfect right to gratify his own natural instincts, though he also admits they may be vices. He has never sought to influence an innocent person towards his own tendencies. History 11. T.D. knows of nothing abnormal in his ancestry. His brother has homosexual tendencies, but is also attracted to women. A sister, who is very religious, states that she has little or no sexual inclinations. They were all of a dreamy disposition when young, to the disgust of their teachers. He sent the following account of himself from the university at the age of 20. "When I was a child, before I went to school at 9, he writes, I was already of an affectionate disposition, an affection turned readily to either sex. No boy was the cause of my inclinations, which were quite spontaneous. No doubt part of the cause may be found in our social system, by which ladies are rather drawing-room creatures to be treated with distant respect. When I was 10, at a preparatory school, I first began to form attachments with other boys of my own age, in which I always had regard to physical beauty. It is this stage in which the sexual element is latent that Shelley speaks of as preceding love in ardent natures. At 12 I learned masturbation, apparently by instinct, and I regret to say practiced it to excess for the next 7 years. Always secretly and with shame, and often with the accompaniment of prurient imaginings which did not prevent my relations with those I loved being of a very spiritual nature. Masturbation was often practised daily, with bursts of repentance and abstinence, latterly more rarely. But until I was 15 I really knew nothing of sexual matters, and it was not till I was at least 17 that I was conscious of sexual desire, which I repressed with shame. Owing to excessive self-abuse, I am unable to admit except manually, but desire is strong. I think naked contact would suffice, and in any case, intercrural connection, pedicatio, and fellatio, I abhor. I love boys between the ages of 12 and 15. They must be of my own class, refined and lovable. I only desire the active masculine part. I now regard my inclinations as natural and normal to me. The difficulty is that of leading the other party to regard it as such, besides the young age required and clandestine nature of proceedings necessary. The moral difficulties of circumstances are so strong that I have little hope of ever gratifying my passion fully. I have found myself deceived in the character of the boy twice. The last friendship lasted 3 years, during which time I only saw him naked 2 or 3 times. This caused erection. Never touched him pruriently, and only kissed him once. I have never found a satisfactory object of my affections, and my happiness, perhaps my health, have been seriously injured. At my public school a master helped me to a truer understanding of these things. The merely animal sodomy which exists in many public schools was unknown. What I learned of sex I learned for myself. I am recommended to turn my aspirations to the abstract universal maid, but so far at least I cannot do it. Male Greek statuary and the Phaedrus of Plato have had a great, though only confirmatory, influence on my feelings. My ideal is that of Theocritus XIII, wherein Hercules was bringing Hylas to the perfect measure of a man. My first thought is the good of my friend, but, except for the good subjective influence of passion, I have failed utterly. I am very tall, dark, rather strong, fond of games, though I do not excel, owing to short sight. I am English, though I have French blood, which may account for an unreservedly passionate disposition. Though, unlike other people, I am not in the least feminine, nor has anyone thought so to my knowledge. I can whistle easily and well. I am so masculine that I cannot even conceive of passive sexual pleasure in women, much less in men. That is one of the difficulties in boy love. My affections are inextricably bound up in the ideals of protection of one weaker than myself. In the earlier days, when sexuality was less conscious, this was a great source of romantic feeling, the glamour of which is rather departing. I cannot understand love of adult males, much less if they are of lower class, and the idea of prostitution is nauseous to me. I think I may say that I have the aesthetic and moral sense very strongly ingrained. Indeed, they are largely synonymous with me. I have no dramatic aptitude, and though I flatter myself that my taste is good in music, I have no knowledge of music. If I have a favourite colour, it is a dark crimson or blue, of the nature of old stained glass. I derive great pleasure from all literary and pictorial art and architecture, indeed art of all kinds. I have facility in writing personal lyrical verse. It affords me relief. I think my inversion must be congenital, as the desire of contact with these boys I loved began before masturbation and has lasted through private and public resorts and into university life. The other sex does not attract me, but I am very fond of children, girls as well as boys. If there is sexuality in this, which I trust there is not, it is latent. This statement is of interest because it may well lead us to suppose that the writer, who is of balanced mind and sound judgment, possesses a confirmed homosexual outlook on life. While, however, it is the rule for the permanent direction of the sexual impulse to be decided by the age of 20, that age is too early to permit us to speak positively, especially in a youth whose adolescent, undifferentiated or homosexual impulses are fostered by university life. This proved to be the case with T.D., who, though doubtless possessing a physically anomalous strain, is yet predominantly masculine. On leaving the university his heterosexuality asserted itself normally. About 6 years after the earlier statement he wrote that he had fallen in love. I am on the eve of marrying a girl of nearly my own age. She has sympathy as well as knowledge in my fields of study. It was thus easier for me to explain my past, and I found that she could not understand the moral objections to homosexual practices. My own opinion always was that the moral objections were very considerable, but might in some cases be overcome. In any case, I have entirely lost my sexual attraction towards boys, though I am glad to say that the appreciation of their charm and grace remains. My instincts, therefore, have undergone a considerable change, but the change is not entirely in the direction of normality. The instinct for sodomy in the proper sense of the word used to be unintelligible to me. Since the object of attraction has become a woman, this instinct is mixed with the normal in my desire. Further, an element which much troubled me, as being most foreign to my ideal feelings, has not quite left me: the indecent and often scatological curiosity about immature girls. I can only hope that the realization of the normal in marriage may finally kill these painful aberrations. I should add that the practice of masturbation has been abandoned. History 12. Aged 24. Father and mother both living. The latter is of a better social standing than the father. He is much attached to his mother, and she gives him some sympathy. He has a brother who is normally attracted to women. He himself has never been attracted to women, and takes no interest in them nor in their society. At the age of 4 he first became conscious of an attraction for older males. From the ages of 11 and 19, at a large grammar school, he had relationships with about 100 boys. Needless to add, he considers homosexuality extremely common in schools. It was, however, the Oscar Wilde case which first opened his eyes to the wide prevalence of homosexuality, and he considers that the publicity of that case has done much, if not to increase homosexuality, at all events to make it more conspicuous and outspoken. He is now attracted to youths about 5 or 6 years younger than himself. They must be good looking. He has never perverted a boy not already inclined to homosexuality. In his relationship he does not feel exclusively like a male or a female, sometimes one, sometimes the other. He is often liked, he says, because of his masculine character. He is fully developed and healthy, with over middle height, inclined to be plump, with full face and small moustache. He smokes many cigarettes and cannot get on without them. Though his manners are very slightly, if at all, feminine, he acknowledges many feminine ways. He is fond of jewellery, until lately always wore a bangle, and likes women's rings. He is very particular about fine ties, and uses very delicate women's handkerchiefs. He has always had a taste for music, and sings. He has a special predilection for green. It is the predominant colour in the decoration of his room, and everything green appeals to him. He finds that the love of green, and also of violet and purple, is very widespread among his inverted friends. History 13. Artist. Aged 34. The earliest sex impression that I am conscious of, he writes, is at the age of 9 or 10, falling in love with a handsome boy who must have been about 2 years my senior. I do not recollect ever having spoken to him, but my desire, so far as I can recall, was that he should seize hold of and handle me. I have a distinct impression yet of how pleasurable even physical pain or cruelty would have been at his hands. I have noticed that in young children it is often difficult to differentiate the sexual emotion from what in the grown-up would be definite cruelty. It must have been about this time that I discovered, entirely by myself, the act of masturbation. The process grew up quite naturally, though I cannot but think that the cooped-up life in a London street and a London school, with want of physical exercise, as well as want of landscape colour and beautiful form, had much to do with it. The tone of the school I was at was singularly clean, but I question whether the vaunted cleanliness of tone of day schools can compensate for the open life and large discipline of an English public school. How far the rather frequent masturbation between the ages of 10 and 13 may have had to do with weakly health I do not know, but when I was 12 I was taken by my mother to a famous doctor. He made no inquiries of a sexual nature, but he advised that I should be sent away from London. He had a sentimental horror of violent games, etc., for boys, and put aside various suggested public schools. Finally, I was sent to a private school at the seaside. The private school was clean and wholesome. The plunge into the sexual cocytus of the great public school that followed was effectually sudden. In my day was a perfect stew of uncleanliness. There was plenty of incontinence, not much cruelty, no end of dirty conversation, and a great deal of genuine affection, even to heroism, shown among the boys in their relations to one another. All these things were treated by masters and boys alike as more or less unholy, with the result that they were either sought after or flung aside, according to the sexual or emotional instinct of each. No attempt was made at discrimination. A kiss was as unclean as the act of fellatio, and no one had any gauge or principle whatever on which to guide the cravings of boyhood. My first initiation into the mysteries of sex was at the hands of the dormitory servant, who showed me his penis when he woke me in the mornings, and masturbated me when he gave me my hot bath on a Saturday night. This old reprobate of 45 committed the act of fellatio with most of the boys in turn, as he went the dormitory rounds. For the older lads I cannot speak, but over us younger ones of 14 and 15 he exercised a sort of unholy terror and fascination. He was very popular. We came to him like doves to a snake. When I revisited my old school many years later, he was occupying a very responsible position in the college chapel, and I noticed that he wore the expression of sly reverence which I think I can now instantly detect when I see it in a man. For the rest, the dormitory was boisterous and lewd, and there was a good deal of bullying, which probably did little harm. My principal recollection now is of the filthy mystery of foul talk that I neither cared for nor understood. What I really needed, like all the other boys, was a little timely help over the sexual problems, but this we none of us got, and each had to work out his own principle of conduct for himself. It was a long, difficult, and wasteful process, and I cannot but believe that many of us failed in the endeavour. We had come unprepared with any advice. The principle upon which we were apparently trained was the repression of every instinct. My mother was ignorant from innocence, my father from indifference, and so between them I was sent out helpless. A mother incurs great responsibility in sending her child away unprepared. A parent should not seek to shift his responsibility upon the schoolmaster. Love alone should be the fount from which revelations should flow. The master, from the very nature of his position, cannot reveal. An eminent breakdown in health, due, it would now appear, to quite obvious causes, relieved me from the purgatory of the college dormitory, and I was removed to one of the private houses. These establishments were considered more select and less rough. The social atmosphere was, however, perhaps more unwholesome, because more effeminate, and was full of noble young sucklings. The nominal head of the house under normal conditions might have been a real leader. As it was, the real head of the house was a gilded young pariah, fairly low down in the school, and full of hypocrisy and unnatural lusts. The boy who occupied the cubicle next to mine was also a bad case of sexual misdirection, though he had not the social distinction to make him quite so refined a terror. I had every opportunity of watching him until, 2 years later, he was fortunately asked to leave. He talked bored from morning till night, got drunk on 1 or 2 occasions, masturbated constantly without concealment, had several of the younger boys into femora, though without evincing any care or affection for them, and gave one the impression of having been born for a brothel. His one redeeming quality was an element of good nature, a characteristic one often finds among such as are selfish and irresponsible. I have since been told that he has gone completely to the dogs. Whether this young cub's sexual instincts could have been turned or guided, I do not know, but in a rougher and simpler life than that of a public school, in a more open and less hypocritical atmosphere, he might perhaps have been licked into better shape. Hypocrisy is a vice, however, that schoolboys themselves are fortunately free from. It comes later. The tone among the boys was frankly and violently unclean, though unclean not from instinct, but from want of direction and from repression. I have not a single happy recollection of this period of my school life, yet out of this morass of misbegotten virtues I plucked my first blossom of genuine affection. I call it a blossom because it never ripened even to flower. I had been given the extreme of filth to feed upon at the outset, and now I found for myself the extreme of chastity. It will be a matter of lifelong regret to me that the love which was the lodestar of my school years was never fulfilled or set upon a sound basis of comradeship. When I was about 16½ years old, there came into the house a boy about 2 years younger than myself, and who became the absorbing thought of my school days. I do not remember a moment from the time I first saw him to the time I left school that I was not in love with him, and the affection was reciprocated, if somewhat reservedly. He was always a little ahead of me in books and scholarship, but as our affection ripened we spent most of our spare time together, and he received my advances much as a girl who is being wooed, a little mockingly perhaps, but with real pleasure. He allowed me to fondle and caress him, but our intimacy never went further than a kiss, and about that even was the slur of shame. There was always a barrier between us, and we never so much as whispered to one another concerning those things of which all the school obscenely talked. Any connection between our own emotions and the sexual morals of the school never occurred to us. In fact, we lived in a dream life of chastity that could not relate itself to any human conditions. This was suddenly broken in upon. My friend was very beautiful and an object of attraction to others. That some of the elder boys had made offers of sexual intercourse to him I knew, but to him, as to me, that was unspeakable wickedness. One day I heard that 4 or 5 of these suitors of his had mishandled him. They had, I believe, taken off his trousers and attempted to masturbate him. The offence was probably horseplay of an animal nature. To me it seemed an unpardonable offence. The matter had been reported to the master by a servant, but confirmatory evidence was needed before punishment could follow. I was torn asunder by passions I could not then analyze, and in the end committed the greatest of schoolboy crimes. I sneaked. The action under the circumstances was courageous, but I was indifferent so long as the boy I loved judged me rightly. The result was that at the close of the term 4 or 5 of the senior boys were asked to leave. The remaining brief period of my school life, which had previously been a living hell, became really happy. That this should have been brought about to the harm of 4 or 5 boys whose sin, after all, was but a misdirected impulse for which the system was responsible, seems to me now all very wrong. Of the boys sent away, however, certainly 3 have made honourable careers. For my friend and I, we became more afraid of each other than before. As our affections increased, so our fear of them increased also. The friendship was too ethereal to live, but even yet we still have a deep respect for one another. When at the age of 19 I left school, I was allowed to knock about for a year before entering college. During this time I picked up a sexual experience that may or may not have been a valuable one. I certainly look back upon it now with regret, if not with horror. My father had discovered some months before this day that I was in the habit of masturbating, and he gave me what he conceived to be the right counsel under the circumstances. If you do this, he said, you will never be able to use your penis with a woman. Therefore, your best plan will be to go with a prostitute. Should you do this, however, you will probably pick up a beastly disease. Therefore, the safest way would be to do it abroad if you get the chance, for there the houses are licensed. Having delivered himself of this advice, he troubled himself no further in the matter, but left me to work out my own destiny. The great physician to whom I was taken about this time also gave me his advice on this point. Masturbation, he said, is death. A number of young men come to me with the same story. I tell them they are killing themselves, and you will kill yourself too. The doctor's hope was apparently to frighten his young patients into what he conceived to be natural conditions of life, and one went away from him with the impression that every sexual manifestation in one's self was a physical infirmity due to one's own moral weakness. It took me some time before I could make up my mind to follow my father's advice, but after a period of real moral agony I deliberately and entirely in cold blood acted upon it. I sought out a scarlet woman in the streets of and went home with her. From something she said to me, I know that I gave her pleasure, and she asked me to come to her again. This I did twice, but without any real pleasure. The whole thing was too sordid and soulless, and the man who decides to take an evil medicine regularly has first to make up his mind that he really needs it. At about the same time I chanced to be for a few months in a German university town, and I determined, as I had the opportunity, to carry the parental advice to the logical conclusion. I tried a licensed house. The place was clean and decent, and the conditions, I take it, such as one would normally find in any properly regulated continental city, but to me the whole thing appeared unspeakably horrible. It was a purely commercial transaction, and it had not even the redeeming element of risk to oneself or of offence against a social or disciplinary code. I came away feeling that I had touched bottom in my sexual experiences, and I understood what it was that Faust saw when the red mouse sprang from the mouth of the witch in the Walpurgis dance. These were the only occasions upon which I have had sexual intercourse with women. Looking back to them now, they appear to me to have been almost inevitable, but if I had my life over again I would shun them as I would a lethal draught. I believe I came out of the fire unscathed. Probably, indeed, it did me good, in the sense that it made it possible for me to look deeper into life, though to what extent seeing the torments of the damned makes us do this, perhaps only a Dante could tell. To gain knowledge at the expense of the shame and misery of others I hold to be fundamentally wrong and immoral. What is to me, however, the chief and bitterest thought is that I flung away the first spring of manhood, where I got no love in return. His virginity is, or should be, as glorious and sacred a possession to a youth as to a maiden, to be guarded jealously, to be given only at the call of love to one who loves him, be it comrade, mistress, or wife, and whom he can love in return. The full university life into which I now entered at the age of 20 brought with it a flood of new ideas, feelings, and sensations. The friendships I made there will always remain the central ones in my life. Up to my last term at college, at the age of 24, I still wore my chain mail of artificial chastity, but then a change gradually set in, and I began to understand the relationship of the physical phenomenon of sex to its intellectual and imaginative manifestations. I was not destined to fully realize this for some years, and then exclusively through and out of my own personal experience. It was the study of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass that first brought me light upon this question. Hitherto I had kept the two things locked up, as it were, in two separate airtight compartments, my friendships in one, my sex instincts in another, to be kept under and repressed by the public school code as I conceived it. It is needless to say that I was continually troubled by the customary sex phenomena, erotic dreams, loss of semen, troublesome erections at night, etc. These I repressed as best I could by habitual masturbation and by the regular diet and exercise which academic life made possible. At one time, for the period of a year, I should say, I tried to overcome the desire for masturbation by gradual stages, on the principle of the drunkard's cure, by which he took every day less tipple by the insertion of one pebble more in his bottle. I marked on my calendar the erotic dreams and the nights on which I masturbated, and sought gradually to extend the intervening periods. 6 weeks, however, was the longest time for which I was able to abstain. A few years later the writer of this communication formed an intimate relationship, in which he did not make the first advances, with a youth some years younger than himself and of lower social class, whose development he was able to assist. "But for my part," he remarks, "I owe him as much as I gave him, for his love lighted up the gold of affection that was in me, and consumed the dross. It was from him that I first learned that there was no such thing as a hard and fast line between the physical and the spiritual in friendship." This relationship lasted for some years, when the young man married. Its effects are described as very beneficial to both parties. All the sexual troubles vanished, together with the desire to masturbate. Everything in life began to sing with joy, and what little of real creative work I may have done I attribute largely to the power of work that was born in me during those years. End of Part 5 of Chapter 3. Recording by John Fricker. Part 6 of Chapter 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. History 14. Scotchman, aged 38. His paternal ancestors were normal so far as he knows. His mother belonged to a very eccentric old Celtic family. Soon after 5 he became so enamoured of a young shepherd that the boy had to be sent away. He practised masturbation many years before the age of puberty, and attaches importance to this as a factor in the evolution of his homosexual life. He has had erotic dreams rarely about men, about women more frequently. While indifferent to women, he has no repulsion toward them. He has had connection with women 2 or 3 times, but without experiencing the same passionate emotions as with men. He would like a son, but he has never been able to get up the necessary amount of passion to lead to marriage. He has always had a sentimental and platonic affection for men. Of late years he has formed 2 friendships with adults of an affectionate and also erotic character. He cares little for anything beyond mutual masturbation and kissing. What he desires is the love of the male. In appearance there is nothing abnormal about him except an air of youth. He is vigorous both in body and mind, and has enormous power of resisting fatigue. He is an excellent man of business, is a patient student. He sees no harm in his homosexual passions. He is averse to promiscuity. His ideal is a permanent union which includes sexual relations. History 15. T.S. Artist, aged 32. I was born in England. My father was a Jew, the first to marry out of his family and to marry a Christian. My great-grandparents were cousins. He was a German and she was a Dane. My grandparents were also cousins. He was a Swede and she was a Dane. My maternal grandfather was an English Protestant, and my maternal grandmother was Irish, fanatically Roman Catholic, and a very eccentric woman. In my father's family there have been many members of note. In my mother's family there were many renowned lawyers. My father had an elder brother who was homosexual. He was already at 31 years of age a prominent author, when he died of consumption. I have also a second cousin on my father's side who is a very good tenor. He is also homosexual. In my mother's family I know of nothing abnormal. In neither family is there or has there been any insanity, but rather an overwealth of brain. My parents were an ideally happy couple. They were engaged after knowing each other 6 days, and after being separated 3 months they married. They were married 35 years without a quarrel. I have a brother 3 years older, born a year after their marriage, and a sister 7 years younger. My brother takes after his father in appearance. He is a great lover of women, and much spoiled by them. He is quite normal and abstemious. My sister is a very womanly woman. As a girl she disapproved very much of girl friendships and always confided in her mother. At 13 years of age she met the man she is now married to. They waited 10 years before marrying and are now an ideally happy couple. My sister is perfectly normal and very abstemious. I lived my first 10 years in England, 18 years in Sweden, 2 years in Denmark, 2 years in Bavaria, Austria, and Italy, and am now living in Berlin. I consider myself English. I am mentally a man, but all my physical feelings and desires are those of a woman. I am middle height and very slight, weigh 106 English pounds without clothes. My hands and feet are small and well shaped, head of normal size, features small, eyes green. Have worn glasses since I was 7 years old. Complexion fair. Appearance not Jewish. The skin of my body is very white without blemish. Very little hair on my face. Hair on head and abdomen luxuriant. No hair whatever on stomach and chest. Color of hair auburn, everywhere except below the navel, that black. My father's, mother's, and brother's hair was brown. My sister has auburn hair, and so had the aforementioned uncle. My breasts are slightly round. My hips are normal. I do not gesticulate much. From my material self it would be difficult to draw the conclusion that I was homosexual. My sexual organs are normal. My disposition is apparently bright, but in reality melancholy. Have very little love for human nature, but have a partiality for the British and Jewish races. Hate business, politics, sports, and society. Love music, art, literature, and nature. Deep interest in mysticism. Am clairvoyant. Have been used many times as a medium. Lead two separate lives, an outer and inner psychic life. Am a fatalist and or theosophist. Profound belief in reincarnation, always have had, because when I was a little child I could remember so much. Have an excellent memory dating back to my 3rd year. Have always been too self-analytical. Have from my earliest childhood felt myself an alien. Am very sensitive physically and psychically. Have no wish to wear women's clothing or do women's work. As to clothes for myself, I prefer black and not much jewelry. I could only love a perfectly manly man from 21 to 40 years of age. He must be physically beautiful and well made. Size of sexual organs plays no part. The muscles must be developed, and the hands must be especially well shaped. Hands are my fetish. I could never love anyone with ugly hands. He must have no odor issuing from his body, though I do not dislike faint perfume when clothed, and above all, never have a bad breath. He must be intelligent, love music, art, literature, and nature. He must be refined and cultured, and have been about the world. He must have simplicity in behavior, dress, and manner, and above all be clean-bodied as clean-minded. Cynicism I cannot stand. Here I may state I once owned a St. Bernard dog, which reminded me much of my ideal. He was always sedate, always loving and faithful, generally quiet. He only got excited when out in the elements. I have not been able to get on with people who have no sense of humor. From my birth I was physically weak. First I suffered from eczema, being born with a double squint. I was operated on at 2½ and again at 3½ years of age, with excellent result. From 4 to 12 years of age I had convulsions often, and all the illnesses of childhood. At the age of 12½ years I took scarlet fever, followed by a weak heart which grew stronger after a year, and Bright's disease, which lasted 15 years with hardly a break. This illness had its wonted effect on producing melancholia and upsetting the whole nervous system. Bright's disease stopped suddenly, but was followed by a succession of illnesses. Then I had neuritis very badly. I then removed to Bavaria, and to regain nervous strength I was treated by Freud's psychoanalytical method, with great success. I had a very bad relapse, as my brother, who had just heard I was homosexual, came to visit me and threatened to have me put under guardians if my father should die. It took me weeks to recover from the shock. We broke off all intercourse, and though my brother has been several times in the same town where I have been, we remain strangers. At this time my father died suddenly. Last spring 4 suicides of friends in so many weeks had a very bad effect on my nerves. I am now in Berlin in better spirits, but the cramp continues badly at times. To this I must add that since my 14th year, independent of any illness, I have suffered mentally and physically from menstrual pains recurring every 28 days and lasting from 6 to 8 days. That these were the equivalent pains to a woman's menstruation periods, I could get no doctor to admit till I was treated for a length of time by a German nerve specialist. The physical pains begin abruptly, sudden congestions of blood in the brain and in the abdomen, sudden perspirations, heat and cold, great nervous pains in the small of the back, also in the nerve centers of abdomen and stomach, sharp shooting pains in the breasts and especially the nipples, sudden toothache which stops as suddenly. The skin becomes darker, sometimes mottled. I have the whole time a taste of blood in my mouth, and often everything I eat tastes of blood. I have great difficulty at that time in eating meat. Physical longings for erotic adventure counterbalanced by mental nausea at the bare idea. The mental symptoms are sudden feeling of deep depression, suicidal tendencies alternating with sudden inexplicable lightheartedness, capriciousness and great dissatisfaction with myself and life generally, horror at my own incompleteness of sex, and sudden fits of hatred toward women, and a great longing to be loved by men. This condition changes slowly back to the normal one. It takes several days for me to lose my physical weakness owing to it. Physically, I was developed at 16 years of age. Mentally, I was developed at a very early age, but I kept my inner life quite dark, always playing the innocent. Nobody at home believed me to know anything about life. They were at times very surprised when I fell out of the role I had planned for myself. Up till I was 17 years of age, nothing to do with other people's morals was ever discussed before me. I looked so pure, and do now, that people are always careful in front of me. My father never discussed such things with me. From my earliest childhood I loved men dearly, though I was always at daggers drawn with my father and brother. I worshipped my mother then, as I do now. My sister and I did not at all get on as children, though we are the best of friends now. She and her husband, as well as my mother, have been kindness itself ever since they knew of my condition. Not till I was over 30 years did I meet a man I loved as well as my mother, and he is heterosexual. I must have loved my father and brother at first, but continual conflicts, incompatible temperaments, and mutual misunderstandings, and want of sympathy made life at home horrible. I must admit from my earliest childhood I had a certain contempt for my father and brother because I found them so materialistic. I had all my childhood rows with my brother. My father took his part, my mother mine. After I had recovered from my father's sudden death, my first words were, after reading the letter, "Thank God it isn't mother." I felt a great relief, but it took a long time for me to grasp that I was really free. I have always liked women's society, and as a youth I was very fond of gossip, which I by no means am now. I have many women friends, more than men friends. These women friends are all heterosexual except one. I very often like elderly women. I suppose I see mother in such women. A woman never could make me blush, but a man I admired could easily. I was 23 years of age when a married woman of good family asked me to come and spend the night with her. I went, and though she was beautifully built, cleanly, and though her garments and apartments were of the utmost good taste, I did not have any erection. On the other hand, I felt myself to be most unclean, and bathed 3 times each of the following 3 days. Since then I have never tried to have sexual intercourse with women. In Copenhagen I tried to excite my feelings with every class of woman, in vain. I suppose it is that my nature is so like a woman's that there can be no reaction. With men I am often very shy and nervous, tongue-tied, and my hands perspire. Never so with women. As a child, I loved men and used to fall desperately in love with some who came to the house. I would, when no one was there, kiss their hats or gloves or even their sticks. I can remember, when I was about 6 years, how I fell in love with a very good-looking 26-year-old German. He had very curly hair, and his hands were very beautiful. He was very fond of me, and I used to call him my boy. When visiting us, he often used to tuck me in after the nurse had gone down. He always had sweets or something for me. I can remember how I used to fling my arms round his neck and cover his face with kisses. I would then draw his head down on my pillow, and he would tell me fairy tales, and I would go off to sleep quite happy. At 7 years of age, while staying in the country, a very good-looking groom, about 25 years of age, misbehaved himself with me. I often used to visit him in the stables, as this man had a strange attraction for me. One day he tickled me. While doing so, he produced my penis, and also his own, which was in full erection. He tried in every way to excite my feelings, in vain. For him the occasion terminated in an ejaculation. He forbade me to tell anyone, and I did not do so, but tried to find out all I could on the subject, with little or no result. From that day I hated the groom, and I felt a sort of guilt, as if I had lost something. Not till I was 12 years did I understand. From my earliest childhood I had one ideal of a man. From that ideal I have never swerved. At the age of 30 I found a friend who, though quite heterosexual, has, without giving me any sexual intercourse, given me the love I have always needed. He has been for the last couple of years a second mother, father, sister, brother, and lover. Through him I have regained my health, my love of nature, and he has helped to deaden my hatred towards human nature and my bitterness. A better friend I never wish to find. It has made up for all the years of mental and physical suffering. One strange thing is that the feeling is mutual. He has had a tragic life, for his wife, whom he loved beyond everything, died under very sad circumstances. He says I am the best male friend he has ever had. While with him much of the lower nature in me was stamped out, I shall always look upon him as the turning point in my life. I think he wrought some of his finest influence through his music. He played Beethoven and Wagner for me for a couple of hours every day for months, and thus opened up a new world to me. He is 6 years older than I am. At 10 years of age we moved to Sweden, a country I hated from first to last. About this time I began to notice that there was something strange about myself. I felt myself an alien, and have done so ever since. An event of importance in my life was, I feel sure, when my father's sister tried to take away my mother's character. It was done in jealousy and spite, and my aunt had to beg my parents' pardon. Outwardly the affair was patched up, but I feel sure my father never really forgave his sister. Jews never forgive. This event awoke in me a great hatred towards women, and it was many years before I could at all control it. At the age of 14 I was much with a good-looking musical American, a year older than myself. One day, while romping, very much the same thing occurred as with the groom. I still had no sexual feelings. We remained good friends. I often wished to kiss him. After the first time he would not allow it. He was very much liked among the officers and so-called high society men, and had always much money. About 10 years later I heard he used to accept money after intimate intercourse with those society men. During my 15th year I had a great longing for sexual intercourse with men. At this time the first signs of hair were to be seen on my abdomen. At the age of 16 a gardener, a married man with family, initiated me into mutual self-abuse. He lived in the back house of the apartment house we then inhabited. He was about 40 years of age, an ugly but muscularly developed man. These practices took place in the cellar, to which there were 3 entrances. I never allowed him to kiss me, and the sight of his children always awoke in me a great feeling of nausea. That was the natural reaction of a bad conscience. For the man himself I had the utmost contempt. This man told me of several parks and pissoirs where men met, and I went to these places now and again for erotic adventure. I must here relate that at the age of 16 my mother warned me against self-abuse. It had the opposite effect, made me curious, so I began at once. I have continued ever since, at least once a day. I have never had an involuntary emission in my whole life. Between 17 and 22 it became necessary for me to do so several times a day. Working at art, painting, and above all music and beauty have a strong influence over me and set my erotic longings in violent motion. I have never found this do me any harm. Abstinence, on the other hand, has a very harmful effect on me, upsetting the whole nervous and physical system. I often find that there is a something very much wanting in self-abuse. The commingling of 2 human bodies who are mentally as well as physically in sympathy gives an electrical satisfaction which quiets the whole nervous system. That at least has been my experience. The gardener left and moved to the country. I then sometimes visited pissoirs, or as they are often called, panoramas, because they are round and one sees much there. What I saw in the parks during the long summer nights was quite a revelation. During the summer, when the husbands had sent their families in the country, many of them led a very indiscreet life. What I saw the first summer killed all the respect I had for elderly people. I had always connected marriage and grey hairs with virtue and morals. Then I learnt otherwise. I must say I became about this time a sensual pig. I knew how dangerous these places were on account of the police and blackmailers, but that gave the hunt a double zest. At this time I led a double life and was always watching and analyzing myself. I had to do with heaps of men of all classes. I was often offered money, but that I would on no condition accept. To pay or to be paid kills every sort of erotic feeling in me, and always has done so. I once wished to experiment with myself. I was offered a small sum of money by a former schoolmaster. I accepted this just to see how it would affect me. The next moment I threw the money as far away as possible. Then I saw I had none of the prostitute nature in me. I was simply overwhelmed with sensuality. I considered I was a criminal, and wished to see in how many ways my nature had the criminal instinct. I wanted to see if I could become a thief. I stole a silver button in a shop where antiquities were sold, but I went to the shop the same day again and returned the button without the people knowing. I found I could not become a thief. Then the question came, why had I felt a criminal since my 7th year? Was it my fault? If not, whose fault was it? Not till I studied Freud's psychoanalytical system did I get a clear insight into my own character. When I was 20 years of age, I met a gentleman one night in a heavy snowstorm. We walked and talked and understood each other. He belonged to one of Sweden's first aristocratic families. He was extremely refined. He asked me to his rooms. We undressed and lay down. He had a very beautiful head, and a still more beautiful body. I think that all my erotic feelings were numbered by looking at his beautiful body. To me anything sensual would have been sacrilege, I thought, and I can remember the feeling of awe which came over me.
He was then 20 years of age, but his hair was quite white. First he did not understand, and then he was very gentle to me. I kept perfectly chaste for 3 whole months after the sight of his body. We saw each other often. 8 years later we met for the last time. He suffered much from melancholia. At that time I prevented him from committing suicide. This winter, however, he shot himself. At the age of 22, my sister introduced me to a charming, intelligent, and refined half-English, half-Swedish painter. We recognized each other at once, though we had never seen each other before, and even knew each other's characters to the smallest traits. My parents liked him better than any friend I had ever had. My sister and he were from the first like sister and brother. The first evening in my home he and I kissed each other. The women were mad about him. Later I found many men were too. I was 3 weeks his senior. He had his own rooms. I have never felt any such wonderful harmony as when our naked bodies mingled. It was like floating in ether. With him it was the only time I had been active in fellatio. We were much together, though not much physically, for he had many love affairs with women. What I loved was the way he would cut off all advances of men. I was his little brother, and so he calls me to this day. He is now married in America and the father of a pretty little daughter. We are the best of friends to this day. The 2 years in Copenhagen were some of the happiest I have spent, though nearly the whole time I was in physical pain. In Austria I found among the Tyrolese peasants that the Englishmen who came there in winter for sports and in the summer for mountain climbing have demoralized the young male peasants with money. Homosexual intercourse is easy to get if you are willing to pay the price. Larger in season, less out of season. In Italy it is merely a question of money or passion, but everything in love there is quite transient. In Bavaria I found the love and peace which passeth all understanding. This love and friendship without anything of a physically intimate nature brought me back from the deep black gulf to which I was swiftly floating. When I met my friend I was nearly at the end of my tether. What his love and friendship has done for me, together with Freud's psychoanalytical system, nobody will ever know. Since being in Berlin, a town I like very much, a new life has opened for me. A life where one lives as one likes, if one does not have to do with young boys. Here are homosexual baths, pensions, restaurants, and hotels where you can go with one of your own sex at a certain fee per hour. Berlin is a revelation. But since being here, I find the physical, erotic side of my nature is little excited. I suppose it is the old story of forbidden fruit. My parents kept a very hospitable home. The last 2 years in Sweden I was never at home. I hated society and knew much too much about the private histories of those who came to my home. They all belonged to the highest society. The highest society and the lowest are very much alike. Of course, my parents knew nothing about these people. When I told mother a great deal of private history of people who came to our house, she was thunderstruck, and could at last understand my contempt for so-called good society. I have visited in later years only in artistic and theatrical circles. I consider that class of people more natural than the other class, and much more kind-hearted. My life has quite another side, the mystic side, but that would be a much longer story than this. Suffice it to say, I am of a highly sensitive nature, gifted with second sight. A detailed record of the subject's visions, premonitions of death of acquaintances, etc., has been furnished by him. I tried on 4 occasions to commit suicide, but I now see there is nothing to be gained by doing so. 2 years ago I told my parents about my sexual condition. It was a frightful blow to them. My father had the circumstances explained to him. He never understood the matter, and never discussed it with me. Had I told him earlier, I feel quite certain that, with his despotic nature, he would have put me in a madhouse. My mother and sister have treated me very kindly always. My brother has disowned me. End of Part 6 of Chapter 3. Recording by John Fricker.
Part 7 of Chapter 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2 by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. History 16. Irish. Aged 36. Knows of nothing unusual in his ancestry. His tastes are masculine in every respect. He is strong, healthy, and fond of exercises and sports. The sexual instincts are abnormally developed. He confesses to an enormous appetite for almost everything: food, drink, smoking, and all the good things of life. At about the age of 14 he practised masturbation with other boys of the same age, and also had much pleasure in being in bed with an uncle with whom the same thing was practised. Later on he practised masturbation with every boy or man with whom he was on terms of intimacy. To have been in bed with anyone without anything of the sort taking place would have made sleep impossible, and rendered him utterly wretched. His erotic dreams at first were concerned with women, but more recently they are usually of young men, and very rarely of women. He is mostly indifferent to women, as also they have always been to him. Although good-looking, strong, and masculine, he has never known a woman to be in love with him. When about the age of 18 he imagined he was in love with a girl, and he had often, between the ages of 20 to 30, cohabited with prostitutes. He remembers on one occasion, many years ago, having connection with a woman 7 or 8 times in one night, and then having to masturbate at noon the next day. He is unmarried, and thinks it unlikely that he ever will marry, but he adds that if a healthy, handsome, and intelligent woman fell in love with him, he might change his mind, as it would be lonely to be old and alone, and he would like to have children. He is never attracted to men older than himself, and prefers youths between the ages of 18 and 25. They may be of any class, but he does not like common people, and is not attached to uniforms or liveries. The requisite attractions are an intelligent eye, a voluptuous mouth, and intelligent teeth. "If Alcibiades himself tried to woo me," he says, "and had bad teeth, his labour would be in vain." He has sometimes been the active participant in pedicatio, and has tried the passive rôle out of curiosity, but prefers fellatio. He does not consider that he is doing anything wrong, and regards his acts as quite natural. His only regret is the absorbing nature of his passions, which obtrude themselves in season and out of season, seldom or never leaving him quiet, and sometimes making his life a hell. Yet he doubts whether he would change himself, even if he had the power. History 17. Age 25. Is employed in an ordinary workshop, and lives in the back alley of a large town in which he was born and bred. Fair, slight, and refined in appearance. The sexual organs are normal and well developed, and the sexual passions strong. His mother is a big, masculine woman, and he is much attached to her. Father is slight and weakly. He has 7 brothers and 1 sister. Homosexual desires began at an early age, though he does not seem to have come under any perverse influences. He is not inclined to masturbation. Erotic dreams are always of males. He declares he never cared for any woman except his mother, and that he could not endure to sleep with a woman. He says he generally falls in love with a man at first sight, as a rule someone older than himself and of higher class, and longs to sleep and be with him. In one case he fell in love with a man twice his own age, and would not rest until he had won his affection. He does not much care what form the sexual relation takes. He is sensitive and feminine by nature, gentle and affectionate. He is neat and orderly in his habits, and fond of housework. helps his mother in washing, etc. He appears to think that male attachments are perfectly natural. History 18. Englishman, born in Paris, aged 26, an actor. He belongs to an old English family. His father, so far as he is aware, had no homosexual inclinations, nor had any of his ancestors on the paternal side, but he believes that his mother's family, and especially a maternal uncle who had a strong feeling for beauty of form, were more akin to him in this respect. His earliest recollections show an attraction for males. At children's parties he incurred his father's anger by kissing other small boys, and his feelings grew in intensity with years. He has never practiced self-abuse and seldom had erotic dreams. When they do occur, they are about males. His physical feeling for women is one of absolute indifference. He admires beautiful women in the same way as one admires beautiful scenery. At the same time, he likes to talk with clever women, and has formed many friendships with frank, pure, and cultivated English girls, for whom he has the utmost admiration and respect. Marriage is impossible because physical pleasure with women is impossible. He has tried, but cannot obtain the slightest sexual feeling or excitement. He especially admires youths, though they must not be immature, from 16 or 17 to about 25. The type which physically appeals to him most, and to which he appeals, is fair, smooth-skinned, gentle, rather girlish and effeminate, with the effeminacy of the ingénue, not the cocotte. His favorite to attract him must be submissive and womanly. He likes to be the man and the master. On this point he adds, "The great passion of my life is an exception, and stands on an utterly different level. It realizes an ideal of marriage in which neither is master, but both share a joint empire, and in which tyranny would be equally painful to both. But this friendship and love is for an equal, a year younger than myself, and does not preclude other and less credible liaisons physicales. But this friendship and love is for an equal, a year younger than myself, and does not preclude other and less creditable liaisons physicales, constancy being impossible to men of our caliber. Pedicatio is the satisfaction he prefers, provided he takes the active, never the passive role. He is handsome, with broad shoulders, good figure, and somewhat classic type of face, with fine blue eyes. He likes boating and skating, though not cricket or football, and is usually ready for fun, but has, at the same time, a taste for reading. He has no moral feelings on these matters. He regards them as outside ethics, mere matters of temperament and social feeling. If England were underpopulated, he thinks he might possibly feel some slight pangs of remorse, but as things are, he feels that in prostituting males rather than females he is doing a meretricious action. History 19. T.N. His history is given in his own words. From the time of my earliest imaginings, I have always been attached by strength in men, and often thought about being carried off by big warriors and living with them in caves and elsewhere. When about 7, a young man used to show me his penis and handle mine occasionally. At private boarding school, masturbation was fairly frequent, and I suppose I was initiated about 12 or 13. After leaving, I occasionally indulged, but nothing happened until I was about 20, except that I was often attracted by strong, well-built young men of a good character. A man who was not honest and good-hearted had no attraction. At 20, I was much attached to a young man of my own age. He was engaged. This did not prevent him on one occasion endeavouring playfully, and with his brother, to obtain access to my person. I successfully resisted, although if he only had been present I should not have done so, but welcomed the attempt, and I have often regretted I did not let him know this. But I had a dim idea that my penis was somewhat undeveloped, and this made me shy. Circumstances separated us. About 2 years later I was crossing the Channel when I engaged in conversation with a man about 8 years older, who was one of our travelling party. I think the attraction was a case of love at first sight, certainly on my side. A few nights later he had so arranged that we shared a bedroom, and he very soon came over to me and tenderly handled my person. I reciprocated, and I look back all these years to that night with pleasure and no feeling of shame. On one occasion, about this time, I happened to be sleeping with another young fellow, an office mate, on a holiday, when I awoke and found him handling my penis caressingly. I gently removed his hand and turned over. I thought none the less of him, but my body seemed to belong only to myself and the friend I loved. He was not an Urning, I am sure, but we were often together, and I much entered into his interests and felt infinite satisfaction with life, made good progress, and many friends. Our physical intimacy was repeated, he taking the active part in our intercrural contact. Then he married very happily. Our friendship remains, but circumstances prevent our often meeting, and there is no longer desire on either part. For some years I was rather lonely in spite of friends. I was somewhat attracted to another man, but his superior social position was a defect to me. Then, when about 28, I came in contact with a young man of 24, of the artisan class, but superior in ideals and intelligence to most men. I loved him at first glance, and to this day. At first it was just friendship, but soon his form, voice, and thoughts entered into my very soul by day and night. I longed always to be near him, to see him progress, and help him if I could. I would joyfully have given up home, friends, and income, and followed him to the end of the world, preferably an island where we two might at least be the only white men. He seemed to embody all I longed for in the way of knowledge of nature, of strength, of practical ability, and the desire to imitate him in these things widened and strengthened my character. The first time I slept with him I could only summon courage to put my arm over his chest, but I could not sleep for unsatisfied desire, and the unrelieved erection caused a dull pain on the morrow. I had always disliked conversation that might be regarded as bordering on the obscene, and consequently was very ignorant on most matters. It pained me even to hear him laugh at such remarks. I think if he had been intimate with me I should have not conversed much on such topics, but now I felt pleasure in such things with him as they expressed intimacy. I dreamed about him, and was never really happy in his absence. The greatest joy would have been to have slept in his arms. The hairiness of his legs and arms were also most fascinating. Perhaps a year later we were again at night together, and this time I, by degrees, felt his private organs, but he was cold, and I felt a little unsatisfied. I wanted to be hugged. This happened once more, and then on a later occasion, not that it afforded me much gratification, but because I wanted to stimulate him to ardour, I attempted masturbation. This aroused his disgust, and I was consequently dismayed. He told me I ought to marry, and although I knew his love was all I wanted, I did not feel but what I could make a woman happy. The constant unrelieved erections which took place when I saw my friend adopt a graceful attitude caused pain at the bottom of my back, and I consulted 2 specialists, who also advised marriage. I did not tell them I was an invert, for I hardly knew it was a recognized thing, but I did tell them something of what had taken place, and they made next to no comment, but implied it was frequent. My friend now felt repulsion toward me, but did not express himself, and as other circumstances then caused a barrier between us to a certain extent, I did not realize the true reason of his coldness. But I felt utterly miserable. When I met a noble woman whom I had long known, I asked her to be my wife, and she consented. Although I told her very soon and long before our marriage of my limitations as a husband, and of my continued longing for my friend, I feel now I did a great wrong, and I cannot understand why I was not more conscious of this at the time. That I was to a certain extent deceiving her relations was inevitable. I had expected to devote my life in making her happy, but I soon found that the true reason of my friend's apparent unfaithfulness was my own action, combined with a feeling on his part that it was as well that our affection should cease even at the cost of a misunderstanding. Since then, 3 years ago, I have not had a happy day or night, and am therefore quite unable to promote happiness in others. Without my friend I can find no satisfaction with wife, child, or home. Life has become almost unbearable. Often I have seriously thought of committing suicide, only to postpone it to a time which would be less cruelly inopportune to others. I see my friend, now married, almost daily, and suffer tortures at seeing others nearer to him than myself. No explanation seems possible, as the whole idea of inversion is so repugnant to him, and being an honourable man, he would feel marital ties preclude any warmth of affection. But all the longing of my life seems to be culminating in a driving force which will carry me to the male prostitute or to death. I can concentrate my mind on nothing else, and consequently have become inefficient in work and have no heart for play. I know if my longings could be occasionally satisfied I should immediately recover, but my fear is that if I killed myself those who knew me in happier days would only be confirmed in the impression of my degeneracy, and would feel my instincts had caused it, whereas it is the denial and starvation of them which would have brought about the result. I know now, by experience of self and others, that my disposition is congenital, and that I have been rendered unhappy myself, and a cause of unhappiness to others, by the too late knowledge of myself. The example of my former friend who married misled me to think I too could marry and make a happy home, so that when the man I loved advised me, I resolved to do so, as I would have done almost anything else he suggested. If I could have withdrawn from the engagement without embarrassment to the devoted woman who became my wife, I would have done so, if she gave me the opportunity. Nothing in my married state has brought me pleasure, and I often wish my wife would cease to love me so that we might separate. But she would be heartbroken at the suggestion, and I feel driven to attempt to relieve my feelings even in a way that has previously seemed repulsive to me. I mean, by use of money. About my feelings toward my child there is not much to say, as they are not very strong. I believe I carry him and help bathe and attend to him as much as most fathers, and when he is a few years older I hope I may find him very companionable. But he has brought me no real joy, though I see other men look at him almost with affection. But he has brought added happiness to his mother. End of Part 7 of Chapter 3. Recording by John Fricker.